Okay. Sorry, this is my first time doing a talk here, so bear with me.
Hopefully it's not the last time.
Well, I guess you'll be the judge after tonight, maybe. Well, thanks everybody for the thanks Brendan for the introduction. Again, my name is Darren Henning. I'm a fairly new member. I joined actually our club here, or our group, about 3 months ago. Now, I'm not a newbie per se, and I'll be introducing myself and what I'm interested in serving in later. You'll get some of the gist of it during this talk. But thought this would be good to do an overview of astronomical filters. First, I have a question for everybody. How many people here are, let's say, 6 months or earlier members? Like have signed on in, let's say, the last year. Okay. How many people? Just 3? Okay. How many, let's say, less than 5? Okay, so this is going to be mainly geared towards you guys. Some of our seasoned folks will probably find some of this a little boring, but hopefully there's always something out of here to glean. So I hope you can bear with me here. So we're going to, I know it sounds stupid, but we're going to go over what is a filter. Sometimes when we use things, we don't think about what they do. It's easy to kind of get misguided into misusing them. So we're just going to do a basic definition, but I think it's important for people to understand that. We're also going to talk about the electromagnetic spectrum and just basically a quick overview for the new people so that they understand which window we actually use for the most of the time, either whether we're visually observing or using a camera, say. We'll just go over some differences between the human eye and, say, silicon sensors. And believe it or not, a lot of people don't think of the human eye as a sensor, but it really is. I mean, we implicitly do, but we don't really think about it. It's important to look at those changes and differences. We'll be looking at color theory a little bit and how optical filters tint images. This is mainly geared towards planetary imaging to a point, but mostly on the visual side. There's some subtle things that people need to understand. We'll look at some specifications. In a future talk down the road, I'll actually do a more advanced version of this, and we'll talk in more depth about figures of merit, but we'll be talking about optical density tonight, mainly because there is some confusion in the, not necessarily the literature, but company specs on the web, and it's important for people to know what this actually means. We'll talk about ND filters. Speaking of optical density, we'll be talking about the importance of neutral density filters and different choices for lunar and solar observing, mainly on the white light side of things. And then some planetary filter choices and deep sky filter choices. And this is just an introduction, so it's by no means fully comprehensive. It's just to give everybody kind of a guide in the group. So, here's some examples of filters. And of course, the last one is what we're talking about today. Can anybody give me just shout out and answer, what is a filter? Can anybody give me a simple thing that's common between these 3 things? Anybody?
Remove certain things from the light or whatever.
I'm sorry, say that again.
Remove certain things from...
Moves certain things?
Removes.
Removes, yes, that's right. This is why I asked the question, right? Because everybody's going, yeah, just a minute here. So filters are selective devices. This is not a dictionary definition necessarily, but it gives you the gist. It removes or reduces either matter or energy and permits a desired signal or remaining material to pass through. So if you think about that, all 3 of these examples, you have this situation. The air filter in your car, right? It's getting rid of dust and debris and maybe even some moisture, so you've got clean air coming through. Same thing with the water filter. It's getting rid of taste, bad taste, or maybe there's some toxic metals. And you want to have the clean water coming through. And then, of course, we want to have the light that we need to be able to image or view our object of interest. So I'm just going to do a quick, this is just going to be a super fast one. I know everybody's seen these ad nauseum, I'm sure. But when we're talking about filters and visible light, we need to talk about the visible spectrum as well. So for those of you that aren't familiar with this, there's about 4 or 5 people here. Maybe they are to a limited extent. Basically, the electromagnetic spectrum covers from the subatomic in a wavelength all the way to like literally kilometers and more on the right-hand side. As you go to the right-hand side at the top, you're getting longer wavelengths, lower energy, and the other direction towards the left, you have shorter wavelength, higher energy. And somewhere in kind of the 2/3 area there's a sliver that's our optical wavelengths, and it goes from ultraviolet through into the infrared. And that's where we're doing most of our either observing or CCD photography. Pardon me. So, as I said before, the human eye is a sensor, so we have to think about what is happening. And most people are familiar with the cells in our eye. We have 3 color cells, which are cones, and then we have one that kicks in later on, and I'll talk about this in a minute, which is our rods. So the cones here act like the RGB sensors in let's say a camera array or something like that, basically, on our retina. And they respond to different color wavelengths, and this just shows the approximate wavelengths there. If you add up all those sensitivities and wavelengths together, you get a what we call our photopic response here, and this peaks at 555, which is in the yellow-green. So when you have enough illumination for your cones to be active, we're always, that's the peak of our sensitivity, and I know a lot of people are familiar with this. This is mainly for the identification of our newer folks. And then as you get dark adapted, so as the sun sets, say, we're going to Glenlee or somewhere else, as it gets darker and darker, we go through a transition period. Eventually we're in dark adapted vision, where our rods are kicking in only. And there's only one type of rod cell, so therefore we see everything in kind of a monochrome. And it's sort of a greeny, gray sort of color. And it peaks at 507, which is kind of lucky for people who view with an oxygen 3 filter, because it's right in that passband, which is kind of handy. But the other thing too, for those of you who are new, if you wonder why we walk around with red lights at night when we're at a star party or something, if you look at where this curve drops off, this is right near the red. So if we use a red light here, we have very little sensitivity here. So I just wanted to point that out for the new folks. If you're ever curious, that's why we use red, because it doesn't affect our night vision. Now, the interesting thing about the CCD and CMOS sensors, electronic sensors versus our eye, is that we have quite a difference in efficiency here. And you can see the peak here for a lot of this is just a typical one. Some of the newer ones are even better than this, but they tend to peak right around the 700 nanometer range, which is just starting to get into the near infrared. We don't actually see the light here, okay? But the camera does. So be mindful of that when I go to the next slide here. But I also just wanted to point out here, this has got a little bit more quantification on the curves here, and you can see we're about double, almost 2.5 times more sensitive at our night vision than our day vision. But even then, the CCDs are much more sensitive. That's why how many people do astrophotography predominantly? Astrophotography, yeah, okay. So you know what I'm saying, there's a reason for taking pictures, right? Now, Brian, are you here today?
I haven't seen him yet.
I haven't seen him yet either. I picked a Canon 6D, because he likes the image with the 6D, but any of the DSLR cameras, and to a limited extent some of the newer CMOS cameras that you can get astronomically, have an optional filter package. And these ones are always on the sensor. The combination of so you've got 100% transmission here and 0 here. The near infrared, I just put the spectrum here so that you can kind of see what the visual spectrum is. This goes, basically peaks around the green and then drops off fairly quickly into the red. That's to offset this huge huge maximum here. Otherwise, you'd end up with a real problem when you're trying to do color balanced image. It's supposed to approximate the human eye, and then of course the electronics can do the rest. So I'd just be mindful of that. Now, if you remove the camera filter, or let's say you could get a modified one, and a lot of people do that with DSLRs. I have one myself. Actually, I have 2. Then in this case, it'll actually it'll go a little further into the red and allow you to do better imaging with HL. So this is kind of an interesting thing. A lot of people, I'm just going to talk about color material, just a broad brush. I'm not going to get heavy into this. But qualitatively, what ended up happening here is, because we've got our cones, and we've already talked about the RGB responses of our eye cells for daylight illumination or relatively bright excitation at night, like through a telescope where you're looking at a planet or something, where you've got enough light to still discern color. Whoops. Here first, sorry, hit the wrong button. About the mid-20s or so into the early 30s, a lot of scientists wanted to understand better how we perceive color. So what they did, there's two components to color perception. One is obviously the tint or chromaticity, and the other one is the brightness. So what they did is they have a series of functions that they converted from these color functions, and it turns out that in 2-dimensional space, if you get rid of worrying about the intensity or the sensitivity we are to different colors based on that bell curve I showed earlier, the photopic one, this is what you get, and this is called the CIE chromaticity diagram. And this happens to be the black body curve here for incandescent sources. The white point is at 6,500. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this, this follows Planck's relationship. And I don't have any heavy math, so you don't have to worry. I may talk about that another time. But in the meantime, suffice it to say, the hotter an object gets, though, it starts to go from red to yellow, orange, yellow, white, eventually, and then gets to blue. And that's where we get our star colors from, for those that are really, really new that don't know that. Okay? So this diagram, even though it's kind of funny looking here, when you look at a monitor as an example, or even this display, when they're doing the color, what they try to do is match this as close as they can to get the maximum number of colors. It's called a color gamut. And so, you know, you'll have like Adobe has an RGB space, and a lot of other manufacturers will also have their own customized red, green, blue space to get the maximum number of colors in here. So when we talk about color, like I said, this is the white point here. There's two different types of mixing that can happen in color. And the one on the right I just want to talk about super quickly here. This is what we see when an object is illuminated by a white source, and then we're seeing the light remaining that's not absorbed by it. Okay? So in other words, in the absence of any illumination, I mean other than just white light, like in the absence of any absorption, the background would be white. So that's the absence of color in this one. And then all colors theoretically mixed would go black. Okay? And you guys have heard of CMYK, right? So these are the primary colors for this particular C is cyan, M is magenta, Y is yellow, and K. So that's how you can get a whole range of colors by mixing those four. Okay? Because the black is used for grayscale predominantly, right? But by custom mixing those, you can actually get that. We see the subtractive color scale in dyes, like on our clothing, paints on the wall, any surface, like I say, that's illuminated, and then we're seeing what light is coming off after it's been absorbed. So in a way, it's acting like a filter, if you will. Okay? Now, that's not super important for astronomy per se, but I wanted to just point out the difference. So when we look at what we're really worried about is the additive color mixing. This is where you're mixing illuminated sources. So as an example, the primary colors now are red, blue, and green. The secondaries are yellow, magenta, and cyan. And the mixture of all of these are now white. The absence is black. And if you think about the background sky at night, assuming you're not looking at stars, you're in between something, it'll look black to you. So that's the absence. Now, having said that, now when we look at this chromaticity diagram, and this is where we're going to be talking about tinting of filters, as I start to remove, if I have the correct proportion of this wavelength and this wavelength, it'll appear white. Now, if I start to remove, let's say, the red here, I start to shift towards the blue, and that's why we start seeing tints in filters. I know it's somewhat rudimentary, but it's just something to get your head around, because quite often people forget this when they're trying to use certain types of filters. They may over-filter their object. Here's an example of a number 11 random filter. This is quite common in a lot of astronomy kits, okay? And it looks obviously yellow-green. Does anybody know, can anybody just tell me why it is yellow-green based on this curve here? So this is the violet-blue end, and then we start getting into the green end here, and then red and near infrared, based on that color chart that I did before. Anybody? No? Everybody's shy today. Okay, it's all right. Basically what's happened here is we've absorbed a lot of the blue and magenta, and even a good chunk of the red and yellow, and what's left is green. So that's why it's yellow-green. I know it sounds like a dumb question, but you know, sometimes we assume things, and it's nice to think about, right? So besides obviously color-tinted filters, there's also filters that are available that don't tint the image. They're designed to reduce the brightness. Okay, as you know, as I just said before earlier, we define a filter as something that selectively removes. So it's never adding anything. It's always removing things, letting the things we want to pass through. So as an example, with a moon filter that you might use on a telescope, this is an example here of a 12.5% transmission. The optical density is defined as minus the logarithm to the base 10 of the transmission of the filter through it. What's being transmitted through it. So in this case, if I have approximately 1/8 the light, we see about 0.9 is the optical density. The reason I wanted to bring this up is because I've seen optical density filters in magazines and through other sources where some people call it like an ND13, and another one would be an ND.9, and it can be really confusing to somebody, like some of our newer members who are looking at getting their equipment set up for the first time. They don't know what these numbers mean, right? So I just wanted to point that out. I think it's very important to remember that. It also comes in very handy when you start looking at getting, let's say, a solar filter for white light. You want to make sure you have the correct optical density. Otherwise, you're going to be risking your eyes or equipment, cameras in some cases. So this is just an example of a moon filter. And again, this one's probably closer to about 11%. It depends on where you decide to do that. This is basically the optical wavelengths here. What I was going to point out here is this is relatively flat, and that's why these appear gray. Okay, so again, neutral density, meaning without much tint. This is an example of a Bader solar film, mainly for photography, 0.0016. I should have made that a little larger. This scale now isn't 100%, it's 0.1%, down to 0, so we're talking very high absorbance. And this one's designed for photographic, so you need to add additional filtering in order to make it safe for viewing. Okay, you need to reduce it by about 16 times beyond what it is now in order for it to be safe to view. But the main thing to be mindful of is the curve in the bulk of the visual here is fairly flat. It does undulate a little bit, but it gives a very natural white light image. Excuse me. So now that we're talking about neutral density filters, there's some solar system objects visually and photographically that really benefit from keeping a color balance for the most part. One is obviously the moon. How many moon fans do we have in the audience here? How many people love the moon? Okay, good smattering. Probably a third or so. Well, the nice thing about the moon is it's almost always up in the sky at some time. I know it's a pain in the butt for astrophotographers because then you get the sky glow and da-da-da-da. But in those days when you do happen to get like a nice crescent moon or something and you've got some time on a Sunday morning and it's just, yeah, that looks really nice. It's always presented, right? I mean, you can always see it. The other nice thing about the moon, for those folks that are new, if you're looking at honing your planetary observing skills, the moon is a great way to start because it's safe to view. It's got lots of detail. It's almost always visible at some portion of the month with a few exceptions. Maybe about 10 to 15% might be kind of borderline as it gets close to new moon phase. But it's a great way to go. And same thing with people who are getting into astrophotography. The moon's a great way to start because you've got it visible all the time. It's a nice big object, so you don't have to fight trying to get a super huge magnification. It's a lot of fun. Now there's different filters that you can use here. Standard neutral density, like that 13% T1, the 0.9 I was talking about. One that how many people have ever used polarizing filters on their equipment? Maybe one or two? Yeah, see? And I find that really interesting because polarizers are one of the few filters that are really underappreciated especially when you're viewing visually, but also they can be very handy in certain circumstances, even photographically as well, because they basically cut the scattered light. I can extend my observing sections by upwards around 2 hours a night, just by, at least on planets, just by putting a polarizing filter in. I just cross-polarize it a little bit to darken the background sky, and I can see a lot more detail on the moon or even, let's say, Jupiter or something than I could otherwise. Now, the neutral density factor, or the optical density factor here is 0.4, which works out to be about 40% transmittance. But the nice thing is you can always stack them as well, and by crossing them, you can actually go down to almost, say, 1 or 2%, all the way up to just under 40% with the two of them stacked. So you have a whole range that you can go through if you need to, let's say, adjust it for when you're looking at the moon and trying to adjust the brightness. So if you have a big dog, as an example, that'd be a perfect way to go. And you also have the benefit of being able to rotate the filters. So the big thing is glare reduction mostly, and the other thing too is sky darkening, dusk and dawn. You can really extend your sessions doing that for not just the moon, but also planets as well. Now, on the solar side, I mean, there's lots of full aperture. How many people do solar observing? Okay, non-H alpha. Okay, so you got to get kind of a mixed bag. Okay. is what we normally see when we're using our eyes, right? And the thing is here that it's very, very bright. Now there's specialty filters, I just mentioned a couple before. Astro solar film is one. 1,000 ohms makes a glass filter that you can put in front of your telescope to reduce the brightness, and then you can stick an eyepiece and you can view details in the photosphere like sunspots and so on, or take images in some cases. One of the best ones is a solar wedge for doing photospheric stuff. These ones use a prism. I'll talk about this in just a minute. The idea here is to reduce the sunlight intensity to keep the image fairly white. So for those that have refractors, you can't use these on reflectors, just for the new folks, because these actually have the light coming into the back end of the scope. They hit this diagonal, and it's actually deliberately uncoated prism here. So usually it's made with quartz or fused silica. Most of them are quartz, optically smooth, at least 10th wave or better. And the idea here is you're actually taking advantage of the reflection off of this to reduce the light. It's also partially polarized. The remaining waste heat and light of the back end gets diffused into either some sort of ceramic baffles or metallic baffles that just diffuse it. And in some cases, they even have a screen that they can, like the Bader one has a screen that you can actually use as part of a sun finder as well. So when we add up, so when we take this 4.6, that's still too bright to look at. That'll still blind you. So what we do is we employ a 1/1000th transmission filter on the diagonal here to cut it down further, and then use a polarized filter on the eyepiece or on your eyepiece adapter going from, say, 2" to 1 1/4. And by rotating that polarizer and crossing the polarization with the image coming off through the diagonal, you can trim the image brightness over a wide range. And it's perfectly safe, but the beauty of it is you can adjust for things like haze, or if you're using higher magnification, you see a sunspot group, you want to zoom in on it. Well, if you have a fixed filter, your image is going to start to dim, and you're going to start to lose detail after a while. This works very well. Any questions on that? Now, this is a contention with me. I might get in trouble here, but I've had a really big issue with, for many, many years about certain types of astronomy filter kits that are offered by stores and even the bigger companies like Orion and Celestron and so on. These random filters, and many people, how many people have these in their, or I think just about everybody that has a scope, right? Okay, well, the thing I don't like about them is they were originally designed for black and white photography, cinematography and black and white films, way back in the 20s and 30s. And of course, astronomers were using them for taking shots of planets and so on, and then combining images, not unlike how we stack images now, do RGB stacking. But the difference is, though, they were using black and white film. Now, if you think about monochrome and then think about that chromaticity thing we talked about earlier, if I use a complementary color as a filter, I'm going to darken that feature, so therefore on black and white it doesn't matter, it's seeing all colors kind of as a grayscale, so therefore those features will show up just fine. However, if you're visually observing, depending on the actual filter, it might absorb too much light and it'll put a heavy tint on the planet, and it's very not only ethically non-pleasing, but in some cases you're throwing away too much light and you may not actually get the benefit anyway. But yet they're sold all the time. And like as an example, anybody look at Jupiter through, say, an orange filter or like an 88? Is that an exciting view for you? Not at all, right? Yet they sell these in like, I don't even know why they still make them. So there are alternatives. There are some random filters that are still useful, but the bulk of these in here are really useless if you're going to do visual. And even with photography, there's better choices as well. So I wanted to point that out to a lot of people. So as an example, some of the newer bandmate and dielectric types, Vader neodymium, those are much more beneficial on certain planetary targets than these RASC ones. They're more expensive, but you'll get much more use out of them. These things almost always sit in the bottom of an eyepiece case and travel around and never get used, right? Now, when we talk about planets, I'm just going to talk about the big four. I'll talk about Venus in a few minutes. Mars being up right now, and we've got Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter really doing a nice little parade across the sky, and Venus too, of course. These are the big three, I guess, that most people will either try to image or view. So, if you really think about the features on the planets and the images that either some of our members have taken or even some of the HST images, or even some of the really advanced astro imaging stuff like people like Damien Peach and so on do. Most of the features on these planets are not green. So they're usually either bluish or reddish, right? Especially on Mars. I know there are some sort of a greenish, kind of greenish-gray tint to some of the Maria and so on, but you can actually bring it out by let's say, enhancing the red and blue response by contrast, but without over-tinting it, okay? So the idea here is to try and have a natural look, especially when you're visually observing, and you want as high a percentage transmission as you can get. And this will vary depending on your aperture. Like if you have a large dot, you can get away with throwing maybe a little bit more light, depending on the seeing and how much magnification. If you've got a small refractor, say an 80 millimeter, or something like that, you've got to be a little careful how much light you throw away because you can't get it back. Okay? So that's why there's different choices here, of course. But I'm a big fan of a little bit less is more, but certainly not the tint like we were just talking about, that 88 thing. Oh, ugly. I don't even know why people use it. Now, a polarizer, of course, is always useful. I mentioned that before for dusk and dawn. I've actually done some observing of Saturn visually in the daytime, and of course those with go-to scopes. I did recommend it many years ago, old school, but it's really kind of eerie when for those of you who haven't looked at Saturn in the daytime, if you get it in quadrature with the sun, so approximately 90 degrees away from where the sun is, there's a natural polarization band in the atmosphere, say plus or minus maybe 15 degrees of 90, and that's where polarizers really shine because you darken the background sky a lot because the light's coming parallel, so it's plain polarized. When you cross-polarize it, you get this nice darker sky, but all of a sudden the object just pops right out, and it's kind of ghostly and eerie. It's really fun. Or I like it anyway. I don't know. You should try it sometime if you get a chance. But anyway, besides that, we have the 82A. Any of these numbered filters, for the most part, other than these kind of ones, these ones where I put a number in front, those are still Ratten series filters, but these are the only ones I would consider are moderately useful depending on the situation. So the 82A is a pale blue. It's almost clear, but there are certain situations where, let's say on Venus or Mars, where you can pull in orographic clouds. Sometimes the detail shows up a little bit easier because they're kind of a bluish cloud. So just nudging that whole tint over to the blue a little bit does help a little bit there. Okay. Also, the polar cap sometimes will stand out a little better, but you haven't just swamped it in the blue and ignore everything else. The 21 and 25s, this is an orange and a red filter. They're kind of a long pass filter. On Mars, you can use them fairly reliably depending on the time that you're observing. They do tend to heavily tint Mars. I'm not a big fan of them, but I have talked to people like Mike Baracus and a few others, and they have actually had some success imaging even with these, as part of their RGB. So they may come in useful, so don't throw those ones away. Those can be handy sometimes. Of course, Mars-specific neodymium filters like the Bader. I'm not necessarily endorsing any specific manufacturer, but Bader makes some very nice filters, and their neodymium moon and sky glow is a really good one on Mars. There's a couple other ones that work very well depending on the type of telescope you have. So if you're looking at getting a good Mars filter, I mean, we're already just past opposition, but you still have a couple of months of good Mars viewing left until at least early spring. I would recommend getting something so you can at least enjoy the rest of it, hopefully. We also have, there's also two other filters I just want to mention. These are kind of unique. During the 2003 opposition, I'm from Edmonton originally, and that particular year we had very, very nice seeing. It was awesome. Like at least 2.5 months, almost every day of peroxide was seen. It was just amazing. So I decided I was going to try and come up with as many different filters I was going to try to see what I could see for Mars. And this is kind of a unique filter here, and I'm just going to mention it briefly. I stumbled across it because remember I mentioned about green not being really prominent on a lot of the key planets that we're looking at. Well, for visual, see, it just dips into the green and yellow a little bit, but it still has a pretty high transmission here, so it's an excellent choice for this. So it brings out a little bit more of the blues, but and the reds as well, which is what you want. It gives a really nice tint to Mars, and everything really stands out just a little bit more, which is what you want in a filter, right? Now, Hoya makes them as well as Schneider, and there's a bunch of other companies like Tiffin makes some as well. These were originally designed for color photography, where people were using daylight film for doing landscapes, and then they'd have to come inside. Maybe you're shooting a wedding and going snap, 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 and then you go into indoors. And the problem is that the fluorescent lighting was imparting a green tint to the images because of the spectral lines and the fluorescent lights. So they use this filter to drop that down to color balance. Nowadays, you don't need to do that because you can do the color balancing with like Photoshop or other things. We have other methods to do it, but in those days, that's what it was used for. However, these are still available, and they are a nice special effect filter. The only drawback, if anybody has only inch and quarter accessories, this one won't help you. These ones won't help you at all. Now, the Hoya ones here, the FLW is not unlike this one. It does dip down a little bit further here. But if you have like a large knob, say 8 inches or above, this would be actually quite a killer, and I think it would be really awesome. I've used this on my 105 before, and it does make Mars pop really well. I find the FLD also works nicely on Jupiter, and it really brings out that beach band in Saturn on good seeing nights. It just pops right out. It's really kind of cool. So anyway, the long and the short of it is that they are useful filters. So if you're curious, I donated 2 filters of the Hoya ones, and they're at the observatory. They should be on one of the shelves. Just make sure you sign them out with Brian if you want to take them home and try them. If you're going to leave them at the site, I guess you guys will have to decide what you want to do with them there. You could try them when you're at the observatory site and just see if you like them. You can even try them on the club scope as well, because that 12 inches would be really, really good. What you need to do, though, to make these work on 2-inch accessories, some of the 2-inch formats are still available, but they're getting harder to find because that's not a common thread size anymore, other than for astronomy and some specialty applications. But 46 millimeter is very common size. These are available. You can get them at camera stores. I find buying them online, like places like eBay and Amazon, a lot cheaper. You know, some of the online stores sometimes will have them for cheaper. They usually run around $30 or so, plus or minus a bit. But if somebody's asking more than 50 or 60 bucks, don't waste your money because you can get it cheaper, and they're still new. So these basically then would be you just use a thread adapter called a step down to adapt it to 2-inch accessories, and then it doesn't kill your aperture at all. Like you're not vignetting too much. They work very well, so they're worth a try if you get a chance. Now, Venus is, of course, it's the third brightest object next to the sun and the moon, typically. And because of the high reflectivity or albedo on the planet, we need to knock down the glare because it's still fairly small, but it's bright as hell. So if you try to look at Venus without any sort of glare reduction, you can still see things, but especially just the phase, but it's just so blinding. It's not fun. I mean, it's nice to say, hey, I saw Venus, but other than that, you're not really seeing anything. It's like looking in a headlight. So ideally, what you want to do here is to use, again, ND filters, like a polarizer or cross polarizers. You can use a combination of these or a standard ND filter with an 82A, just to kind of tilt it a little bit to the blue. I'll talk about that in a minute. There's also some red portions of the spectrum that would be beneficial for photography, mainly going with a 25 filter, which is the deep red rattan. And then, of course, there's some really unique filters here for photo, like if you're going to do photography. There's a Beta U, which is strictly an ultraviolet filter only. It totally absorbs the visual spectrum. However, these ones here, this rattan 18A and the B+W403, are actually, they'll pass a little bit of near infrared, just below 700, and they'll pass some UV up to about, just into the middle of the UVA band. But if you're using them for photography, as long as your telescope can properly focus both those wavelengths effectively, like a refractor can sometimes, then you should be fine. You'll get some really interesting effects there. This is the Beta U, and on the Beta U filter, again, like you can see here, this is about the edge of the visual spectrum here. This is hitting into the UV. This is the UVA band, basically, that you're looking at. So photographically, like if you try to look through it visually, you'd see nothing. But photographically, as long as your camera has that filter widened or broadened or removed, or you're using a CCD that doesn't have a filter that's, like a lot of people will shoot through let's say an ultraviolet and infrared cut filter. You can take that off and shoot through this thing, and then you'll get the effects you want. So I'll just kind of rifle through really quickly deep sky filters. And again, this is just strictly a Sort of an overview for people. How many people like to do skyscape photography with their DSLR? Oh, that's too bad, because I kind of geared that part of it mostly to that, but that's okay. I figured that, you know, a lot of our newer members, especially people who haven't been in the hobby for a long time, probably, I mean, if they have a camera, it just, if they're interested in astronomy, that's the first thing they do is stick a camera on a tripod and try to get some nice images of the sky, right? But anyway, having said that, the main thing with any of the deep sky or sky glow filters, the common feature is that they usually have a passband here that passes all the critical wavelengths for most of them. There's some exceptions I'll talk in a minute about, but the idea here is to grab what you need and then get rid of the rest, just like any other, like the definition we were talking about before. These are all air glow and spectral lines for artificial lighting, like low pressure and high pressure sodium and mercury lights. So the mercury vapor ones here, we get rid of, and here. And then we pass hydrogen alpha and all the main hydrogen ones so we can actually image nebulas or other objects accordingly. Now this is just an example of, this is by no means comprehensive, but it kind of gives you an idea here of the relative spectral response of these. So where we have the light pollution, all of these are getting rid of it. As we go down the list, obviously it gets more and more selective. And then we get to spectral line filters, right? Where they're basically just passing one spectral line. But the thing is that on a, let's say if you're using a city light suppression filter, you want as much light otherwise to pass and then get rid of the light pollution. There's quite a few choices that are very good for that. This is just an example of, this is the IDAS LPS V2. I have one, I use it on my DSLR, sometimes it works fairly well. I've also shot through my telescope with it as well, and it does, especially if you have moderate sky glow, it's very effective. Extreme sky glow, it's still, there's no way to really avoid that, right? But it does show some benefit. It's hard to see on this one here, some of the interfering bands, that's gray. The blue here is the pass band for this filter, and it's relatively neutral, believe it or not, just by the way they combine the pass bands. However, like this ultra high contrast one here is, obviously it cuts out more of the sky glow, it passes a little bit here, the intervening bands, but you see you have, most of this is cut out, so therefore you're going to have a darker background sky, either visually or photographically. And then of course the spectral line filters, they're basically a narrow finger or sliver, and they will slice the spectrum up very tightly. These are actually very useful for those who haven't tried them visually. Right now we've got the veil up almost right overhead, and this is an excellent filter for looking at the veil, and even shooting the veil too. One of the things that happens when you're visually doing it, you have to kind of balance your exit pupil so that you're not too wide or too narrow. Usually about a 2.5 to, in that range, 2 to 3 is kind of optimal. So say if you had a 8-inch scope, you could probably, that's what, 200 millimeters, so you could probably do 100 power, whatever, you know, ballpark, you know, in that 80 to 100 power range would be fine. And you would be able to get really, really good. Obviously, you're not going to be very wide field with that. You're going to be kind of looking at very slender parts of the sky on something like that. If you have a wide field refractor, you'd want to run maybe around the 40 to 50 power range maximum, say 30 to 50, and then that way you get, especially if you have a wide field eyepiece like an angler or something, you can really see a good chunk of it. So just a couple of, I guess, myths and facts in general about deep sky filters. I apologize if some of this is a bit of maybe somebody's done a talk on sky filters maybe 5 years ago. I wasn't aware, so I was just trying to add this in for everybody's edification. But would people say true or false? Deep sky filters eliminate night pollution. Boy, we sure got a lot of shy people here today. Don't worry, I mean, I'm not going to, there's no points, you're not going to fail the course or anything. It's false, well, it's partially false. They mainly reduce sky glow, but they don't totally eliminate it, especially in extreme skies. Imagine being downtown Toronto in a park. It doesn't matter what kind of filter you use, you're never going to get rid of it all. So it doesn't fully eliminate it, but it highly reduces it. So I just kind of wanted to make that point because sometimes when people live in more urban settings, they think, oh, I'm just going to get a filter and stick it in my telescope. No, I'm going to be doing it. And then they go, oh, that kind of sucks. So before you invest, make sure that you ask some of the senior members, questions, or some people that have a lot more experience on that. like myself, even though I'm a new member, I've been observing for many years, I'll talk about that later. Not now, but at 9 or something. Anyway, filters are best used with polluted skies, yes or no? These kind of like deep sky filters in general. Are they best with light polluted skies or dark skies? Can you benefit from that? It's sort of a partial false again. They usually actually work better even in darker skies because they reduce the air glow. So there's a lot of air atmospheric bands kind of in the yellowy orange range that can be removed by these, especially the city light suppression filters. And you can actually get some really, really nice images. That's not mine, by the way. I just borrowed them. Sky glow filters make nebula brighter. Yes or no? Okay, the answer is no. They don't brighten the nebulae. They increase contrast of the object versus the sky by increasing basically the signal to noise ratio. So we're removing the noise. It's like when you're in a noisy room, if all of a sudden everybody left and you're having a conversation, now you can hear what they're saying. If everybody's yelling and screaming because it's May Madness or whatever, then you can't hear what the person's saying and you have to scream. Loud bar is a good example of that, right? So that's an oral. So the idea here on deep sky filters is you want bandwidth wide enough for the object or objects of interest. But be careful on your choice because in some cases you may want to look at other things as well. So if you pick something too narrow, you'll limit your choices. So try to get the sort of the maximum utility out of it. Also, make sure that you get one that has a significant reduction of sky glow while retaining as much color balance as you can handle, especially if you're using a DSLR, because you want to have as natural an image as possible when you're doing your skyscapes. Okay? And basically here, just to refresh the bandwidths, the city light suppression or wideband sky glow filters are wider than the sky glow, wider than the ultra high contrast, and then finally the spectral line filters are the narrowest. So if you're unsure, again, like I say, you can always ask some of our members. But these can all be applied both photographically and visually, but again, you just have to be careful on what you're looking at. So I'm just going to recap super fast here. Basically, we covered what a filter is, and we understand that they selectively remove unwanted light energy, and they enhance the contrast of objects and details of interest. So that's really the goal we're trying to do when we employ filtering. You should also try to get the best balance for light throughput as well as image tint or as color balanced as possible, especially when you're looking at a detailed object like a planet or the moon or whatever. You want to make sure that you have as natural a tint as you can get. Obviously, there's some exceptions to that when you're doing high-end CCD photography where you're using, let's say, an RGB filter and then doing, stacking later. But in general, if you're just having to employ one filter to do a quick sky shot, this is what you're trying to get. Visual photographic differences for filters, again, just be mindful of the human eye versus the CCD or CMOS camera that you're using. If you have an astronomical CCD camera that doesn't have a filter, you're using a thread-on or an accessory that does your visual passband, just be mindful of, if you're removing it, that you're going to swamp things out. But there are situations where you may want to do that. I know Mike Caracas has been shooting the moon with a Bader long pass filter. I think it's a 746 or something. And he's been getting some really, really good images that helps to steady the scene. So some of the near-infrared stuff can be very, very handy to do photographically. We introduced chromaticity and just gave a little idea of color theory, just so you understand a little bit more why things are tinted and how our eye sees color. Like I said, it was just a broad brush overview. It's no means comprehensive, but I hope that helped a little bit. We also talked about optical density and percent transmission numbers as they pertain. I talked about mainly how they pertain to neutral density, but it really applies to any filter. This particular figure of merit, you can average those curves that I showed for other things, and you'll get an average percentage of transmission, although that's a very rudimentary one when you have a very complicated passband response. But at least it gets you somewhere if you want to know how much light is going on. We talked about neutral, lunar, and solar filters, some pretty good choices and things that you can do, plus the special filter, the wedge. For those of you who aren't aware of it or didn't know how they worked. Planetary filters, just what's better, what's not. Again, the rapid types. I think most people, at least the gentleman up top, agree that in some cases the NP-tinted ones are really useless. And like I say, I don't know why they're used. And then we just kind of did a broad overview. In a subsequent talk, I can get into more detail about how they're fabricated, how they work, different optical figures of merit and so on. But this is basically what we covered tonight, just kind of to get a broad brush on what are optical filters. Any questions, anybody? Yeah, go ahead.
You were talking with the light pollution and the sky blue filters.
Yeah.
How are they now with more LED lighting happening?
Well, that's a very good question, and actually that was going to be my intermediate talk that I'm going to do later on, but I can address that now. Actually, that's a big problem. I actually have a sky glow curve, 4 quite common numbers of different LED illuminants, and it's bad. There is one that has a peak just outside of the pass band of let's say actually one of I think it's the IDAS filter, and then there's also another like the peak, like the main peak, like it kind of, I'd have to draw it, but basically it goes like this. Okay, this will be the violet and this will be the red. So I'll just kind of do this animation thing here. So the curve kind of goes like this. So it's not quite 0 at the violet end. Okay, and then it goes up, and then there's a peak in the blue around like I think it's 450 or something, and it's quite broad, so it kind of spills over to about 460, 465, and then it starts to peak up, and then it kind of tails off. That's kind of ballpark what you're seeing. So the problem is we don't have any nice lines to knock out.
Yeah.
So that's going to be a problem. I think moving forward, I don't have an answer for you as to how we're going to address that. I think what we're going to have to do is, as astronomers and even as other naturalists want to minimize light pollution, I think the idea is just to have more cutoff and maybe less illumination, because you don't really need them that bright. They're very, very bright. They could be dropped down even like by 5 times and they'd still be effective. So that's a very good question. Anybody else? No? Well, thanks, guys.
Thanks, Derek. Oh, hello. I'm Brendan. I am the somehow current president of the Winnipeg RASC. And what that means is that I will be guiding you through all these things tonight. So we just had Darren give us a talk on astronomical filters. I would say it's good enough that I might even call him back up here at 9 o'clock to talk a little bit more. Right now, you're listening to me you will be listening to me give some announcements. Then we'll get a Sprucewood Star Party update from Dennis. Brian will do a what's up, and then Danielle will give us a what's new in the science of astronomy. After that, we will have a refreshment break. I do have an announcement to make, which is that John and Margaret have ended their, I don't know how many years it's been. They're very, very long and dedicated contributions to our coffee refreshment breaks. Gail has graciously taken over, so big thanks to her, with some help from some other folks. So that's going to carry on as it usually does. And then after that, we're doing a joint presentation. I'm calling it Astronomer Profiles because I couldn't think of anything better. But we'll have a few people up here to talk about what they love about astronomy. So should be good. On to announcements. I have been working with Riding Mountain to do an observing event with them on the long weekend. They're calling it their Dark Sky Weekend. They're actually putting quite a bit of effort behind this, which is really cool. So it should have a decent amount of, they're dedicating the whole weekend to it. So there'll be a thing on Friday night. We're going to try and do some solar observing during the day. They've got campsites booked. I was talking to them, we won't be able to get a group of one or anything like that, but they've clustered them together, so we will be close by. If you are available, if you'd like to come out and help, please let me know. I haven't really entirely worked out all the numbers and the details yet, but it'd be great to have some folks out there with their telescopes. So. If you have any questions, let me know. Yeah, I'm still working on the details, so we're open to a lot of ideas at this point. I couldn't make it the last month. We did have our members barbecue. Brian, sorry, I want to say cut the lawn around, so in my stead. So I don't know. I burned down? Good. Bunch of party animals. Yeah. Danielle, who will be giving our what's new. She also runs open houses at the Lockhart Planetarium. You want to say anything about it?
Sure. The planetarium is still under construction, and so we've been having them here on campus, but in also at University College, but in a classroom. And so we've been having a series of talks by professors and graduate students about distant planets. So far, we have one extragalactic. The topic for August is the moon, and so that one should be really fun. We have a couple of young boys above 11 that sent us 34 questions about the moon. And so we're designing a talk to kind of address those. So it should be interactive and really interesting. And then we're going to continue into the fall until the new planetarium is up and running. But we really welcome interaction. A lot of people are really interested in observing when it's clear. And so if you are interested in coming to the talks, you're welcome to. And if you're interested in bringing a telescope or helping guide some observing, I would also love the volunteers that would be great.
Thanks, Danielle. All right. If you are a club member, you get access to our loaner scopes. I asked Stan what the current status of the loaner scopes was in an email, and then realized now that I completely forgot what you said. I just tuned you out like I normally do.
What?
Exactly. Where are we at for the loaner scopes again?
Well, I'm looking, one of the scopes was supposed to be returned today, but I don't see the people who would be returning it. So
Okay.
one of the dogs, and then Dennis, is it here?
Yeah.
The solar scope is here. If nobody wants it, Dennis does.
Okay. Sounds good. Dennis, I'm going to ask you for the solar scope for writing on it again. Just saying that out loud so I might have to remind myself to dock it. But yes, so if you do want a lunar scope, this is a very bright slide that shows you what we have available. Need a filter. The two dogs are really good. If you're just getting into this, I highly recommend the 8-inch Dob. It's like the classic beginner telescope. It's decent sized aperture, very easy to set up. All that's great. I think the solar scope is also really cool because the life of me, I can never justify purchasing one, but now that the club has one, I don't mind using it every now and then. It's kind of nice. So it's a good little perk. Definitely recommend talking to Stan if you'd like to check one out. Easiest way to get in touch with him is actually via the website. Go to the contact form, select the loaner scope thing, and it'll go right to Stan. So.
Can I make one more comment?
Yeah.
The other thing to remember, and I've actually written a second article about loaner scopes for the that are available. You can't take it home, but we've got the 12-inch out at Glenley. That is technically a loaner scope where you can book it for the night, booking it through Brian. And also now at the Glenley Observatory, we also have, aside from the 12, we've got a 6-inch Dobsonian that sits in the warm room. So anybody who's out there, who just happens to be there and doesn't have a telescope with them, they can just take that one and use that one outside. So there's another one that's available for that. And we're working on details of making the, we've got a proposal of something to make the 14-inch Dobsonian more friendly, usable out at that site. And we're also looking forward to getting a C8 available for the Glenley site. So there's going to be a couple more scopes coming online in the next short while. Right, Brian?
Right.
I say that because he'll be the one who'll be responsible for people who want to book that scope. We'll talk to him on those.
Sounds good. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, so on that note, go to the observatory. So if you remember, you get access to all that cool stuff. Everything Stan said, plus all this. So it's a nice little perk, again, of club membership. Done with the pitching. One thing that Dennis has been doing, Dennis Lyons has started to organize our Explore the Universe program. He sends out some information to the club about this, but I thought I would just reiterate it here every month as part of my talking. So Explore the Universe is a beginner's program. This is a really good way to give yourself some direction when you're trying to getting to the hobby. Space is big. It's extremely big. And huge. And what that means is that there's actually a lot to look at. And a lot of it you don't even know if you're capable of looking at. You just hear about something cool, and you might see a really fancy Hubble picture, and then go and try and find it, and then just get frustrated and pack everything up and go drink. Which is not terrible. I've done that. It's a fine way to go, but it's not. You don't want to do it like right off the hop, right? So I will say this is a really good list of objects for beginners. There's some challenging ones in there as well, so just fine.
Hey, Brendan, can I ask a question about that?
Yeah.
Okay. Can it be done using GoTo, or does it have to be full on manual?
Dennis, what's the ruling on that?
I don't believe you use those.
Okay. Yeah. No GoTo. Yeah. I think we checked it. Yeah. No GoTo on that. So.
So clarification on that then,
Yeah.
if you have a go-to mount, all you do is just manually slew, you just don't go-to, and then it's on our system, right?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, all of this is effectively on our system, right? But it's, and I think it makes a lot of sense because I think personally, I have, and this is why I actually really love the 8-inch dog, is because it's a dog somebody now. You have to point and shoot the thing, right? And what that does is, it doesn't just teach you where these tiny little objects are. It actually forces you to kind of like look up and understand the whole sky, right? A go-to scope kind of forces you to do that a little bit because you got to find your stars and stuff like that. But I find with a go-to scope, like, especially once it's like 2 in the morning, I realize that all I've been doing is just slewing around, and I haven't actually been looking at the stars all that much. And having to do it manually and doing it yourself really does kind of teach you just over time reinforcing, oh, okay, this line to here, that line to there, and that sort of thing, right? So I think as part of the program, it's a really important thing to reinforce, is that this is really there to help you learn the night sky and give you a good set of objects to start looking at. So with that, so for this month, so every month Dennis picks a few items and sends them out. So I'm just here to again reiterate what your targets are going to be for this month. For constellations, Cygnus and Lyra, this is really easy because if you look carefully, Cygnus is actually really close to Lyra. So if you find one, you should be able to find the other. It's also part of what's on the summer triangle. So look up. This is the thing where you're going to have to start pulling out a star chart and having to look up. For the moon this month, observing orbital motion. So this is a thing where you're going to notice a little bit of shift. I would recommend taking a look at. For a lot of this stuff, I would highly recommend. Like, I'm not going to stand up here and tell you how to find all these things, but I would highly recommend using it as an opportunity to do a little research online a little bit. Right? So you're going to be looking for Mercurium, which is off on the side over there. You're going to be looking for the Aristoteles impact crater. That was a little more challenging, but you should be able to find it. So get a good moon map and start taking a look at these things. And there are many good moon maps out there. For the solar system, we had Mercury and Saturn picked. Deep Sky, M13, super obvious. M17, the Swan Nebula, a little more challenging. Oh, maybe not. It's a little low. And then for the double/multiple stars, Epsilon Lyra, which is actually which is a fantastic multi-star system that is really good to know about. Alrighty, that is everything I have for announcements. Did anyone else that is here right now have anything to add? I think we're good. All right, Dennis, did you want to give an update for Spruce One?
Sure. You got a slide.
What's that?
Sylvia sent you slides.
Sylvia did not send slides.
Oh,
Double check.
Everybody hear me? All right, great. How many people here who have not been to the Spruce Woods Star Party? All right, so this is really good for you because all the rest of you have been there and to work on it. If you're brand new to the club and never been to Spruce Woods, you got a great chance to find it. Because you're going, where the heck is that thing? You may not be able to find it. You wander over to your neighbor who knows that stuff. So where is that? And they kind of say, well, look over here. You go back to your scope and you start playing with it. And there it is. All right? So just some ideas on how to tie it all together. So I apologize. I thought we had a slide to tell you how the events were going.
All right.
But I'll give you, well, that's okay. Good thing I brought my glasses because I put them really hard. That for me. So basically, it starts Thursday night. It's September 6th to 9th. Thursday night is really just an observing and astrophotography night. Friday night is the big one. There's registration during the day. And then telescope equipment tour in the afternoon. Swap table, there's a swap table in the afternoon. For those who don't know what that is, everybody brings the stuff you don't use anymore. You bring it there and you have yourself a little swap meet where you get to trade, coerce people, and get free stuff sometimes, or sometimes that piece you've always been waiting for because the other half isn't there to tell you you can't buy it. And then that evening, again, we have observing astrophotography. But the Friday night is Jerry Sperchanchi puts on a big vinyl tour. For those people who have not been there or experienced a binocular tour with Jerry, it's incredible. I cannot say this enough about it. If you're new to astronomy, this is really, really good because it shows you how you can take a pair of binoculars and really, really appreciate the night sky. You don't need a bunch of equipment. You can carry a pair of binoculars wherever you go. So just really recommend it. Saturday, our guest speaker is Dr. John Rice, talking about star spots. We have Ralph Croning is going to be talking about meteorite hunting and collecting. And that night is the banquet. And then after the banquet, we'll be heading back to the observatory. I just got to change back here for a second. We want to go to the banquet because at the banquet, Sylvie has arranged a whole bunch of prizes. In order to win the big prizes, you have to be at the banquet. Sometimes you can't attend the observing events and be there all weekend, but maybe you can take the drive out, attend the banquet, do a little observing, and then head home. So the big prizes, we have an 8-inch Dob to give away this year, and a 102 millimeter Celestron refractor go-to scope, with a whole bunch of other little prizes and things to give away. And then again on Sunday morning, we have a little breakfast together and close up and pack up. Does anybody have any questions? So all of those who haven't printed off their Explore the Universe certificate are going to go home tonight, print it off, so they've got it for the Spruce Wood Star Party. Stamp.
So where do you get a copy of this amazing registration form?
The amazing registration form?
Yeah.
I believe it's on the website.
It is on the website. So I was going to say, if you go to winnipeg.rasc.ca, you click on the Star Party link, and all the information's there. You scroll down, you should be able to find the registration form pretty easily.
And I believe advanced registration is only $50. There's everything. All the meals, breakfast, all that stuff. All right? Awesome.
Thanks, Dennis. All right. Yeah, I will actually echo. I will echo the praise for Jerry's Bino Tour. Even not even just for the new members, but also for the seasoned members that have not gone and partaken for some reason. I can't imagine why you wouldn't have at this point, but 10 years ago, I went to my first Spruce Wood Star Party, and I got to do that Bino Tour, and it made me appreciate binoculars. It made me appreciate seeing the sky at a slightly different magnification that I hadn't thought of before. It was really worthwhile and gave me a really good perspective on observing. So I do really recommend it. Believe it or not, 10 years ago I considered myself a seasoned observer. So I don't know what that means for me now. Okay, Brian, are you ready for what's up? I think I'm tenderized now. I've been beaten enough.
Did everyone get out to look at Mars? Good.
Yes.
Good. If you haven't, you should. Did Brian?
You're gonna feel really
Brendan,
Yes.
earlier in the meeting, some people were discussing Mars. It's a little disappointing now in the fact that that storm is just subsiding. So a lot of the detail is still, in some areas, is still a little awash. But it truly is the only opportunity that you get to see it this large, because it is a challenging object because of its size.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. It could be better, but it's still pretty good. Go ahead, Brad.
Great, thank you, Brendan. Okay, we'll talk about what's up the next guy for August. Wait, sorry. There we go. Wait. This is not my week. Smash my phone. Okay. This was supposed to play. Okay, anyways, we'll talk a little bit about the planet. No, I'll speak. Because it's supposed to be done automatically. All right. Let's see how this is going to finish. Anyways, okay, so let's talk about some of the planets we have. Okay, Mercury. Unfortunately, Mercury is a little too close to the sun to do any observing, but apparently it's going to get a little bit brighter towards the end of the month. Having said that, we have Venus. Apparently it's still, because the geometry involved in it, we won't be able to see Venus. The condition of it, the observing part of it would be unfavorable, so we won't be able to see it. That's why I put second to Mercury, because of the innermost planets. Of course, Mars. I'll talk a little bit more about Mars. So the closest approach was July the 31st. So the magnitude should be about minus 2.8 I have here, but it's going to fade really fast. So, and like Stan said, we do have that dust storm on the planet, but we'll talk a little bit more about what we observed on Wednesday. Okay, Jupiter, what can I say? Yeah, it's pretty low in the sky right now, but still, we'll get a chance to see it. Saturn. Well, Saturn's be mostly in the southern sky in the evening. It's going to be 2 degrees from the moon on the 21st, but still, it's kind of nice to have all three planets. Well, you got Jupiter, you got Saturn, and we got Mars coming up. All right, now, I was doing a little research on this. I came across, this is almost actually the minute, but pretty close. Okay, so you got the innermost planets. It's kind of interesting that all these planets are really close together. And of course, you've got Mercury, you've got Venus here, Mars is at the closest point right now, you've got Jupiter, Saturn, but it's kind of weird that they're all pretty close. So I picked this up. I tried to see what would be a good time to view Mars, and it's due south. Unfortunately, it won't happen to more like towards the mid-August, where it'd be around 10 o'clock, we due south, but it's going to give you an idea. So this is today. So we got Jupiter here, we should have Saturn, and then we have Mars. So again, take advantage of it. You got all three planets in the sky all at once, and they're pretty good. Okay, so what do we have for events happening in August? Not much, really. As you can see, we have first a meteor shower happening on, what did I say, the 13th. So we do have the new moon on 11th. So I was thinking of hosting that night. Actually, it's August the 12th, which is a Sunday. I was thinking of it. Of course, it's a work day next, but again, it's very rare that we don't have a moon right next to it. So I'll set up an email to the RASC list about setting it up. Okay, now I want to point out this meteor shower because it overlaps the Perseid meteor shower. So again, it goes up to August 19th. That's why we probably saw a bunch of meteors on that Mars observing night I had on Wednesday. Thanks for everyone coming out. It's pretty good. So then we talk about the Perseid meteor shower. Okay, so I said around 2 a.m. It's probably the best time to view it, according to my notes here. But again, we have the new moon on August 11th, which is great. It should be quite spectacular because you have a lot. It's 110 per hour, which is, but of course it's going to vary when you actually do happen, because it's not always the same. So again, it overlaps the other meteor shower there, but it's going to peak on August, well, it's going to peak August 12th, really. So it's on a Sunday night, so we'll start observing around, what, 11 o'clock at night, and then hopefully we'll catch some nice meteor showers. All right, again, of course, it's named after the constellation Perseus. What else? Here's a shot I did a couple of years ago with Kevin. This is what we call the pit. And Kevin and I agree that what we're going to do in the upcoming months is get some of the new members out there to this pit. So we'll put it on the RASC list when we're going out. Usually he does put something out. And then if you want, you can tag along with one of us, because this is a really nice dark sky to get out to. It's pretty far, it's more north. But again, what we're going to do is we'll get everyone who wants to come out to join us. And we'll show you exactly where it is. So apparently it was just Kevin and I that night, and I think everyone else was at the Glenview Observatory, which was, I think, a Thursday night at the time. But anyways, it was a good time. Kevin was already there eating sunflower seeds, already set up, so the time I got there it was pretty late. Okay, so a little bit about that Mars event that I put on Wednesday. So we saw Jupiter. I had the LX200 going with the binos that I have, and I found out that it's got to be set up a little bit better for proper viewing. So even though we try to get it in focus, you still have to adjust the eyepieces. So that's Mars right here, in the Milky Way. We did, I think around 11:30 at night, we did see a little bit of details, even though there's supposed to be a storm going on there, but I think we did see some contrast, but it was kind of hard to tell, but we did check the other telescopes to confirm that. So with the binoviewers, I was hoping to see a little bit more detail, but you have to set it up a little bit better in order to actually see Mars. So anyways, okay, well, I'm just going to talk a little bit about Mars because I talked about this last time. Of course, it's not the absolute biggest. This year, it was probably bigger, like 2003, of course. Next time, we get a chance to do it in 2 years from now, right? It's only going to drop to 22 arcs across, but still relatively big. So, and of course, I just have some little diagrams here about the path is. This is the size of 2018, and then what was the smallest one? 2012, actually, I have it, so that's pretty small there. So anyways, just kind of give you an idea of the orbit of Mars. And again, this is just a comparison how fast it's going to get big, right? This is May, and this is July 31st. So you can see how big the comparison, and it's relatively very, very bright. Okay, just a little bit of comparison charts here that have, again, just to give you an idea what Mars was like. I like to keep track of Mars. Every chance I get of Mars, I'm out there. It doesn't matter how cold it is. I had it looked through the 8-inch, my 12-inch. I have a Beam 6-inch go-to now with my binoviewers. So any chance I look at Mars, I always stress it. But unfortunately, Mars is kind of like low in the sky. And of course, now we have a storm on it, so we don't have to see much detail. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Danielle, you're up next. One thing I did want to mention, so you should be familiar with this magazine if you're a member, Sky News. We always gather up a bunch of them to hand out to the public. So we will be taking some of these to Spruce Woods, and then to Riding Mountain later. But if you want to take some and pass them along to family, friends, coworkers, dentist offices, random people on the street, anywhere. That's good ideas. Feel free to take some. Like I said, if you're just taking it for yourself and you're a member, then you're just doubling up on magazines. And I don't think you need to do that. But yeah, please do take some if you want to hand them out to the public.
unless I explain to you, if you haven't already seen it, what exactly it is. Hopefully you'll be as excited about it as I am. But I couldn't start what's new without the big news. Ryan talked about this a little bit. But Mars last week was at opposition, and then last Friday was at closest approach. They weren't exactly concurrent. So opposition occurred July 27th. Closest approach happened on the 31st. It's a game of angles on circular elliptical orbits. But I have that the red planet hasn't been this close to Earth since 2003, so it's been about 15 years since Mars has been this close. It was a little bit closer in 2003, and it'll be very close, but not quite as close as this again in 2035. So according to NASA, Mars was 57.6 million kilometers from Earth at its closest point. And so in 2003, it was a mere 2 million kilometers closer. But that does change its angular size. This is an image from Hubble where you can see some detail of the north and south polar cap and some of the detail. And as was mentioned earlier, we do have a dust storm on Mars right now, which will veil some of the detail. And so to give you an idea of the media, I got asked to go talk about Mars on TV, and I think a lot of times the media or the general public, those less educated than yourselves, freak out that Mars is going to be the same size as the moon, which is never the case. So it's every time. My last open house was kind of about like the supermoon isn't that super. But anyways, so to give you an idea of how much larger Mars appears now at closest approach than it did earlier this year in May, we have the apparent sizes as viewed by Hubble again, and the apparent magnitude of Mars in May and now. And so you can see that Mars is a lot brighter now and appears larger. With a telescope, you can tell the size difference. With your naked eye, it's still going to look like a dot, but a brighter one. And so this is within the same orbit in the same year. Here I have, why is it that not all closest approaches are the same? Why is it that we have these 17 or 15-year cycles? And so Earth's orbit is fairly circular. Mars's orbit is a little bit more elliptical. It's the second most elliptical orbit of all the planets. And so it takes 26 months for Earth and Mars to go from opposition to opposition. Opposition being, you can draw a straight line from the sun through the Earth when you hit the planet Mars. And so because you have an ellipse and roughly a circle, and it takes not an integer number of years for them to go from opposition to opposition, that spacing is called the synodic period. You'll end up having opposition alignments at different points along that orbit, those two orbits, and the relative distances shift. And so here on your left, there's a diagram of 2003 on the right of these concentric orbits. And then every 2 years, 26 months, you have another opposition that kind of slowly rotates around the orbit. And so you have 2003 the closest, kind of right at your 3 o'clock position, and then at about 5:30-ish, there's this year's opposition. And so you can see that it occurs in a place where the orbits are closer but not quite. And then in 2035, it will be just a little bit higher up, so not quite as close as 2003. And then here again on the right, I have some Hubble images of, unfortunately I couldn't find the same two time ranges, but Mars at closest approach for successive closest approaches. So you can see here on the top is 1995, which is shown here, and then 97, 98. So again, this 26-month synodic period, 2001. 2003, relatively larger, which you can see here, 2005 and 2007. And so not all closest approaches are equal, but Mars doesn't get ever to be the size of the moon. So it's exciting. We can time these closest approaches and measure the distances, and over very long periods of time, the eccentricity of Mars's orbit is actually changing due to interactions with Jupiter. So on timescales of tens of thousands exciting news about Mars is last week we found liquid water. And so we've known that Mars has had liquid water in the past. There's a lot of geological evidence for water flowing, like rivers and lakes. We have seen what we think is water condensing and kind of melting along ridges and down valleys. But we've never seen standing liquid water until there was a press release last Wednesday. And so Mars Express, which is a European space Mars orbiter, found liquid water hiding under the south polar cap of Mars. So it's a lake, and so they think it's similar to Lake Vostok, which is in Antarctica, under the ice sheets there. So I apologize for the garbled author list, but so this, the press release was last Wednesday. The article was actually published today in Science, and so it's entitled "Radar Evidence of Subglacial Liquid Water on Mars." The first author is Professor Orose. I may be butchering his last name, but it was published today. So here's the South Polar Cap. This is an artist's rendition of the Mars Express spacecraft, and then radar data showing the reflectivity of the surface, and then the blue area there is the lake. And so we'll talk a little bit about how they made that discovery. And so the lake is about 1.5 kilometers under the planet's south polar ice cap. And so that ice cap is a mix of ice and dust and sediment in layers, kind of like a phyllo pastry. And so if you see the acronym PS, oh shoot. Okay, if I run into it, it's the south polar layer deposits. Anyways, the lake is about 20 kilometers across, and based on the reflectivity, they think it has to be at least a meter deep. So it may be a shallow lake, but it's quite wide and it's a stable body of water. And so here are figures from the paper that I pulled up. And so here on the left is a infrared topographic map from the Mars Express spacecraft. And so this is Planet Australis in the south. And so the South Pole is right at the crosshairs. And then, this is a relief map. And then on the right is an infrared map from the Themis instrument, which is not the same as the Themis spacecraft, but over here. This is the camera, an infrared camera. And so you can see that that goes a little bit deeper than the image on the left. I should also state that this image fits into that black square. So you're zooming in, but you can see that topographically it's a very smooth area under the ice, except for this little escarpment on the bottom right. And so the lake is right in the smooth area, and so the data that first tipped them off to the presence of the lake is along that red track. And so the way that they used, that they take radar measurements, in case you aren't familiar with the technique, is that there's a radio antenna on the spacecraft. It shoots down a beam of signal. It times how long it takes that signal to hit anything reflective and bounce back. The amount of time it takes to travel is the depth. That signal, depending on the reflectivity of the surface, sometimes only a fraction of it will reflect and the rest will keep going and then reflect off of something else. So you can get multiple return signals from the same pulse. And so this is what they did. So Mars Express would send down a beam. So here you have the beam in black, and then you have a reflection from the surface ice in light blue, but then some of that signal keeps propagating lower down, hits bedrock, and then reflects in red. And then as the spacecraft keeps orbiting, that second deeper signal that doesn't reflect on the ice ended up hitting something that was very reflective. And so that sent back an even stronger signal in blue. signature of the interface between ice and something very reflective, and then based on the relative power of those two signals, you can deduce that that has to be water. So here is the actual data, and so on the top you have the two-way return time, so the time it takes from the signal to be launched from the spacecraft to reflect and come back. And then the bottom, the x-axis, is the distance along that red track from that image. And so you can see that it's mostly black, so that's, so at the very top of that first graph. And then there's a relatively flat, bright layer. That's the ice cap. And then you see these small layers, kind of between 140 and 150 some. And so those are the layers of ice and then sediment and ice and sediment, like that phyllo pastry I was talking about. And then between distances 40 and 60, there's something very bright below that phyllo pastry layer of sediment. And so that's the first detection of the lake, is they found this very reflective layer. And so this bottom plot here is just quantitatively the power of the signal returned. And so the red is the surface, that's your polar ice cap, and the blue is the sediment underneath. And you can see that for the most part, it's a much weaker signal, except for between about 45 and 65, where the signal is even stronger than the surface. And so they knew that they hit something very reflective, and this is how water behaves on Earth. And so the orbit took it over that region again and again and again. And so the previous slide showed just that one trace, and now here we have a composite of traces. And so the image on the top left is a color-coded topography map. And so again, you can see that it's quite flat. And the black outline is where they saw the bright reflection. And so here we have the return signal in blue and gold, which is the blue bomber colors, right? Yes. I'm not from here. But yeah, so this dark blue triangular area has a very strong return signal, and so that's the shape of the lake. And so we now have kind of an outline of this lake. So it's about 20 kilometers across, 1.5 kilometers under the ice, and at least 1 meter deep. Okay, and so Mars is a lot colder than Earth, and so it's also going to be fairly high pressure because it's under a lot of ice. And so for something to still be liquid at those temperatures, we know that there needs to be some sort of substance mixed into the ice, and so there's a chance that it's just very heavily saturated sediment. So that is still a possibility. However, it could also be a very salty water. And so the same way that oceans don't freeze when it's 0 degrees, we need to cool things down even more. This could be a very salt-rich lake with a lot of magnesium, calcium, and sodium perchlorate salts. And so this could act as a type of natural antifreeze. And so this is really exciting. So there is still some water left on Mars. And if there ever was life of any type on Mars, this would be a good place for us to look first. Okay, any questions about water on Mars?
I have a quick one.
Yeah.
I was going to say, just refresh my memory, how does the perchlorate, how is it formed? Because like, obviously you're mentioning, I know I've read that there's a lot of different perchlorate salts, and even with the rovers they're detecting perchlorate. What's the source of the?
I'm not sure, but I'd be happy to look it up.
I'm just very curious, yeah, because even in a very briny environment, perchlorate's a pretty good oxidant for life as we know it.
Okay.
Depending on the concentration.
Yeah. Okay. I'm not sure. That's a good question. Yeah.
I just wondered if that lake is at a depth of about at least 1.5 kilometers, is it not possible that the pressure will be sufficient to give you liquid carbon dioxide, possibly? themselves are mostly carbon dioxide, I understand, with water as well, water ice.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure.
So,
Just a thought anyway.
Yeah, I think it'll be worth keeping an eye on the research to see what comes up. Great. Okay, so now that we are all experts at radar technologies, I'll talk about some other exciting radar discoveries. So the first are asteroid twins, and so there are two near-Earth asteroids, 2017 YE5, and so they passed within 16 times the Earth-Moon distance last month, so at the end of June. And so a collaboration between 3 radio telescopes detected them, and so the Goldstone Solar System radar first discovered them June 21st and 22nd, and so it detected that it was 2 lobes with a distinct gap between them. And then Arecibo, a large radio telescope which was featured in a James Bond movie, located in Puerto Rico, blasted the asteroids with radio wave, with radar, which then bounced off of the asteroids and then was measured by the Green Bank Radio Telescope, which is a massive pointable radio telescope in Virginia. And so it analyzed the return signal, and so it detected and confirmed that these asteroids were not 1, but 2 separate asteroids, each about 900 meters across, that are orbiting each other. And so they have about a 24-hour orbital period, and they have about the same mass. And so this is exciting. It tells us a lot about our inner solar system. And so even though they appear bright in this GIF of them orbiting, these are actually dark as charcoal and they're rocky. But we're slowly learning more about the inner solar system, which will tell us about the evolution of our solar system and how it formed. So the next exciting radar radio telescope is the MeerKAT radio telescope, and so this is part of the Square Kilometre Array radio telescope, which is being put up in South Africa at the moment. And so this is a precursor, and so it'll be integrated into the mid-frequency component. And so here's an image of the MeerKAT array. It took about a decade of construction and design. It's a full array of 64 pointable radio telescopes. And so it was inaugurated July 13th. And so less than a month until the first image, which is pretty good. Combining signals from that many telescopes is not a small task. And so what it returned was this radio image of the center of the galaxy, which I find breathtaking. And so this is very zoomed in. It's a 2-degree by 1-degree panorama, which encompasses an area of about 1,000 light years by 500 light years. And the radio frequencies here are between 900 and 1,600 megahertz roughly. And so what you're looking at is the dark areas are radio relatively quiet. The bright areas are bright sources of radio waves. And so this bright one right in the middle is Sagittarius A, the black hole at the center of our galaxy. You can see some supernova remnants that kind of look like rosettes off to the side. You can see some interactions, some star births and deaths. And then you can also see these very strange, very narrow filaments of strong magnetic fields. And so if you get electrons accelerated fast enough, they'll emit very strongly in the radio. And so you can see this filamentary, interestingly, perpendicular to the plane of the galaxy, strong magnetic fields filaments. And so this is really exciting because in the visual, there's dust that completely shrouds the center of the Milky Way. It's very difficult to see in a lot of wavelengths. And so MeerKAT reveals the clearest view yet of the, I like this phrasing, rampant star birth and death taking place there, star forming regions, supernovae so what they do is they shoot out 4 laser beams in a pattern that they know, and then the atmosphere messes up the laser beam patterns, but they can essentially take a picture of that and then use computers to simulate the atmospheric conditions that are necessary to distort the lasers in a certain way, and then deconvolve that backwards to retrace the signal to what the image should have been. That technology is called adaptive optics. We've been using it for a little while, not on scales like this. This is an 8-meter telescope, and so it produces incredibly focused images. So this is better than Hubble has done for Neptune, which is really remarkable. The downside to this technology is it's really only very accurate for a very small field of view. So you're going to be looking at things that are very small if you want this level of resolution. And so I'll end with, unfortunately, very pixelated images of Muse using its adaptive optics with the 4 lasers. Any questions? All right, well, I'll be around for the break if you need.
Thanks, Danielle. Yeah, it's kind of crazy to think that Mars Express was launched in 2003? Yeah, and like, so, I mean, this is data that they're taking and using, you know, that's quite old. So, you know, when you hear about all these spacecraft launching, and yeah, I remember when Curiosity was, you know, when it landed, and within a month I had friends of mine asking me, where are the results, right? I was like, there's still just warming up the computer systems. Like, it's going to take a little bit of time. But I think this is a really good example of one where it's been up there for a very long time, and we're still reaping the scientific benefits of it. So anyway, I think it's a great example of just how science can take a little bit of time, and that's okay. So so this is now officially our refreshment break. So you may feel free to stretch your legs, enjoy some beverages and some snacks. We'll meet back up here for about 9 o'clock. Profiles. There's got to be a much more clever term for this, but it was the best I could come up with. But I will say what I guess the inspiration for this. So Darren and I were actually chatting when he first joined up with the club, and you know, he said, you know, it's really interesting to hear from people why they got into astronomy, right? And I think a lot of us all got into it for the same reasons, but or similar reasons. But I think one of the things that kind of gets lost over time, and one of the things, you know, again, as a tenderized observer, who's been around for a while, I feel like over time you lose a little bit of that perspective, you know, a little bit of that spark, right? And you kind of forget why you got into it to begin with, right? And I'm actually really happy with the group of people that reached out, because, you know, it's not Stan, it's not Jake, right? I love Stan and Jake, they're great, right? But they've been in the club forever and we've heard from them lots, you know. It's not me, you guys have heard me talk ad nauseum about this stuff, I'm doing it right now. So what I'm really excited about is hearing from some new members, some members that have been around for a while that we don't hear from very much, some younger members. So we'll see how this goes. My plan is basically to just run through each person. I've got the slides here, and I'll let them come up, say their piece, and then we'll move on to the next person, and then we'll see where that takes us. So I'd like to introduce you to, they can wave as I introduce them. Well, you'll see them when they come up. We have Michael Papst, Darren Hennig, who you heard speak earlier, David Nightshade, who's sitting over there, Jacob Peterson, or Yasha, back in the background, and a completely new member, Kyla, who literally emailed me to say, hey, I just joined the club, this will be my first meeting, can I come out and talk? And I was like, that's awesome, I love that. It's great, so who knows. I did want to try and give us a little bit of direction, so I did pose some questions to them in a not really interview style or anything like that, but just get something to think about, right? And I don't think that there's a need for every single person to answer these questions, but it was kind of the theme of, how did you get into this, right? We've all got our story. What's yours, right? What's your favorite thing to look at? You spend time looking through a telescope. What's cool? Why do you like looking at it? What's neat about it to you? What does it mean to you? And what inspires you to keep going? I can't say personally that I've ever had that many nights where I've been out in the freezing cold wondering to myself, why am I fighting with this beer drive right now? It wears on you a little bit, and it's good to remind yourself, why this is cool. So that's my spiel, and now I will finally stop talking and introduce you to Mike Paps. Absolutely. I can absolutely.
Well, hello everybody. My name's Michael Pabst. I think I can just do it. It's probably been 10 years since I sat in front or stood in front of a lecture hall, and I think there's more people here tonight than were at my last lecture on zoology. So it says something about zoologists or astronomers. When the questions first came out, it hit me at exactly perfect time because I just sat down at the computer to answer a couple of questions from my children. They wanted me to write a little bit about my history and things that, how I got involved in certain things. And I don't know whether it was a test, whether they're worried about the old guy, or they actually were interested. So the first question sort of popped up right off me and said, gee, I'm going to do something about this and come to the club and explain how I got started in astronomy, which is really how I got started in science. I spent almost 40 years here on the University of Manitoba campus, over at the Freshwater Institute. I was an adjunct professor in zoology and for a short while in environmental studies. So you might ask, how did that all happen to get involved in astronomy? Well, there's a few of you who were probably around at that time, but I think back and what was a trigger for me was an event in 1957. And that was laying on the back lawn of the house and looking up at Sputnik. Well, I now realize that we were looking at the third stage of the rocket. We really couldn't see Sputnik. But at the time, the whole emphasis was looking up at the sky, seeing this thing fly over, and listening to the guy on the radio. I lived in Niagara Falls, Ontario, and talking about this was the beginning of the end. That the missiles were going to come, and they were going to be targeted at the hydro plant in Niagara Falls. But the one message that a lot of us got out of that was the importance of science. So my career started, I think that night, in 1957. But you might ask now how that happened, that a person who got that inspiration from Sputnik went on to university, I guess spent over a decade at various, 3 universities in Canada, and took exactly 0 astronomy courses. Well, how that happened, there are 2 reasons. The first is an excellent book written by a gentleman called Mr. Odom, Dr. Odom, about ecology. And they caught me at a very vulnerable time in first year. I read this book and said, this is the science for me. Astronomy disappeared. Well, the other motivation, though, was I was at university at a time when all us baby boomers were charging into universities. So the university strategy was they put what I used to call the gatekeeper course in front of each of the major sectors. And astronomy was over in the physics and physical sciences departments. So the gatekeeper was Calculus 135, advanced, at the University of Waterloo. And after about 5 or 6 hours in class, I think what the kids do now is go, I went, and realized that I was not in the right class. So my astronomy career went on hold. I went on for a career in fisheries and ecology. But I always always had that astronomy thing in the back of my head. Never found the time. You know, graduate school, I said, oh, I'll go out at a course in astronomy. Never quite happened because there was something else to do. By the time I got to the PhD and did my comprehensive exam, I was still going, I gotta fit in that astronomy course. And my prof or supervisor at the time said, no, you're not. You're not doing too well in, I think it was dinosaurs or something. So I had to go take a course in dinosaurs. So it never happened. So along comes retirement, and I was retired like a lot of people who retired in Manitoba. Went to Arizona, and one night I went for a stargazing night sky event in Sedona, and just fell back in love with the whole thing. And then the next couple of days later, a very accommodating spouse let me take her to Flagstaff, and we went to the Lowell Observatory there. Fantastic program. If anybody hasn't been there, if you get a chance, go down, buy a day pass. They let you come back. You can go and have a nice fancy dinner and come back after it's dark. And they open up their various telescopes, and it's just an amazing event. So all this sort of happened. I came back and I said, the heck with it. Family got me a telescope. I started coming to these meetings, and so that's how I got my long way start into astronomy. The second question, what's your favorite thing to look at and why? Well, I'm still kind of newbie, having taken all that time in science, but never quite got to astronomy. Now that I have, I kind of give this one a bit of thought, and I would say, since Skywalk Telescope, Jupiter has to stand out. I got it about a year and a half ago. Jupiter was in a really good position, and it was an exciting event, and it still kind of goes that way if I'm out and it's a particularly good night. So I say Jupiter, probably the top of the list. The second, it's been talked about here, quite a few of the club meetings, is Orion and the Orion Nebula. I think that's what I watched or saw most often at Flagstaff. Never quite got that one onto my system either, and if it's a really good night, the earlier part of the winter, my telescope will go, start looking at the same thing. To the point that my children, who now occasionally come out with me, go, geez, we somebody saw that, sort of thing. And the other thing that I got, and I think it was show of hands earlier when we were talking about filters, is in the magazine, the sections on lunar, looking at the moon. It's really helped me get quite a re-engagement with the moon. It's easy to find, even with, I have one of these telescopes that has the star finding system. That's the worst program. I've worked with a lot of programs in my career. That's the worst program I've ever worked with. That thing will throw you out if you key punch one thing wrong. Boom, throws you back to the beginning again. So I will master it. That's one of my future things that I like to do. But I think the moon is quite up there and quite underrated. And the articles that are in Sky News are absolutely excellent. What I find about them is they give me a target. They give me, instead of just wandering all over the moon going, ooh, yeah, oh, yeah, it gives me a specific thing that I say, okay, I'm going to try and see what the gentleman who writes the article sees. So I find that's a really important part of my reintroduction to astronomy. Finally, what inspires you to keep going in the hobby? I guess a couple of things. One, my family bought me the telescope, so if it doesn't get used, there's going to be some retribution. So there is a motivation there that I have to confess to. But I think for me, what it is most is things like we were talking about at the beginning of the club meeting, the idea of the exploring and finding certain things. I think it clicks or regenerates. My wife refers to it to my encore science career. That sort of inspiration to look and find something. And I've been finding that what I enjoy the most is I'll find an article or go online and look at the exploring the night sky sort of thing, and find something where they talk about some double star. Somebody will describe it all in detail. I find that I really, really enjoy going out on a night, when I get a nice clear night, get my little telescope set up, I go hunting for that thing to see if I can do what the people do in the book. The final thing I wanted to mention, because it's been quite a revelation to me, was that I read an old astronomy book. One of the things I did when I came back into astronomy is I went out to use bookstore and I started buying up all these old astronomy textbooks. And one of the books that I read was, I think it's the Night Sky from the Backyard or something like that. And one of the things that the author really pushed was the idea of keeping a logbook. And I don't know, again, whether this triggers back to my days in the lab, and you always had to keep good notes and everything, but I have been finding, and I've been really trying hard to do it, is after I go out and I do my observations, or even before when I'm going out, I'm going to say, I'm going out to such and such a place, the night sky is whatever conditions, and I'm looking for this, and then I'll fill up my little logbook. I found that that's been really a way to focus my going out and observing, and made it really enjoyable. So, that's me back in astronomy.
Thanks very much, Michael. I definitely recommend the logbook thing too. It's good stuff. It's incredibly hard to do. I'm terrible at it, but it's been fun to, like, every now and then go back and look back through that stuff that I've been doing. Your future self will appreciate it. Okay, Darren.
Hey, mic's still working, right?
Yeah, it's starting on sitting there.
Testing. I could yell, but I think it's easier to use this. It works pretty well. Okay. Well, hello again. Hopefully you've had enough of me after this talk. But no, I came up with this idea actually with Brendan, and the main reason for it, I found that when I was meeting some of the new members that had signed on either just around the time that I did or a little bit before, I was talking to them, and they're saying, yeah, I don't even know what to get for, in fact, I met a lady today that was sitting across from me, and she's going, I'm just getting back into the hobby, and I really don't know what I'm going to get, and, what should I look for, and so on. And I thought it was kind of important for us to kind of remind where we came from. And it also helps people understand what's available too. So a little bit about me. Just as sort of a historical thing, I moved about just under 5 years ago from Edmonton. I work for a company called Week Instruments. They're a multinational instrumentation company, and so I handle all of the Manitoba region. And yes, I volunteered to go out here. I wasn't like exiled. Just in case. I get jokes from some of my customers when I first moved here. They're like, "What'd you do wrong? Did they keep you out?" I'm like, "No, I chose this." And I found it's really been a good move for me. I like it out here. I love the people. They're really friendly. I really like the skies generally. Even though Edmonton's still fairly flat, it's flatter here and no mountains to get in the way. I grew up in BC, so I find some people love like the Rockies and so on. I find they get in the way of my sky. Sorry, that's just me. That's pretty humbug, isn't it? But if you've seen enough mountains, you can do that. I just joined about 3 months ago. I'd been meaning to do it a while back, and then I finally said, what am I waiting for? I should just pull the trigger. With Mars coming up, I thought it was a good time to join the club, and I'm really glad I did. So thanks for the great welcome to some of you that I've talked to already. My favorite objects, I've got a bunch of them. If I had to have a single object that I would say is one of my favorites, planetary, I actually really love Jupiter. Well, Saturn and Jupiter are close match. I would say really though, my favorite object is the double cluster. I just love that. It's just, when you get a really good dark night and you've got, if it's framed just right, you just fall into the star fields and it's just to keep going and going. It's almost like going down a rabbit hole and you just can't take your eyes away. It's like real eye candy. So that's probably my single favorite object. And I also really enjoy lunar and solar observing. I do some white light NH alpha. I also enjoy observing carbon stars. I started picking that up about, 6 or 7 years ago. And for those of you who are new that don't know what a carbon star is, they're very, very deep red stars. Basically, in a nutshell, the star is actually coated with a layer of carbon or soot, like charcoal, whatever. And it absorbs the rest of the shorter wavelengths. Remember when we had the spectrum? And so it passes the red. It's not unlike the effect, it's different, but it's not unlike the effect at sunset when the blue light gets scattered away and the red still comes through, so the sunset looks red. It's sort of like that. I know that's not the exact scientific way, but close enough. I've started to do some slitless spectroscopy with some of my telescopes as well. I've kind of reached a deadlock here because I need to get my guide scope working a little better so I can do some of the dimmer objects. But I actually have the ability to do visual as well as photographic spectroscopy. So I've actually got a special eyepiece adapter where on a bright star, like a good one for public outreach, you aim your telescope and you drop this little accessory in and it actually spreads out the light into a nice little rainbow for everybody to see. You can see all of the, well, not all, but a good portion of the absorption bands and emission bands in the stars. So that's kind of fun. And there's some other things I want to do with that as well down the road. That's one of the few endeavors that we, as amateurs, we can actually still do some science. I have 3 cameras. I've got a 40D. It's actually an astro-modified one. And it'll actually have some extended red response, so I can do really good skyscapes with it. And I have 2 M-series EOS M's. And I've got one that's stock, so I haven't modified it at all. And the other one, you might remember when I had that camera up with the filter thing there, we were talking about color balance filters. Well, I had that one removed, and it's just opened right up, so it's full spectrum. Supposedly it passes 280 to 1180, but the sensor, it's obviously limited by the sensor detection curve. So that's kind of neat. And I can use special pre-filtering to just do visual if I wanted that. But it'll allow me to do things like infrared photography on like Jupiter, say, or the moon or whatever. Primarily I'm a visual observer. I guess you guys kind of figured that out by now. Although, one of the things that's really interesting is, we talk about binoculars and you, Brendan, you were mentioning about that binocular tour out at Spruce Woods. It's really amazing how binoculars do give you that extra sort of edge with the wide field. It's putting this kind of totally different perspective. We're so used to zooming in on things. Sometimes stepping back gives you a whole new perspective. Not to mention it's darn lovely sometimes, In fact, this morning I was actually watching sunset over I had the day off today, so it was kind of nice, but I was looking with my big binoculars at the sunset on the Apennines with my polarizer. It wasn't as dark as it would be normally, but yeah, it was still neat to see. So I started observing at 7 years old. So I've been doing this for 45 years, believe it or not. I guess the grays probably tell me a little bit there. I couldn't believe it was 45 years when I had to think about it. I started with one of these little sort of a collapsible telescope on a little dinky tripod, but boy, I was going. It was a Christmas present. Then about 2 years later, I got a pair of 7x35s. And allowed me to, with the planisphere that my folks gave me, it was one of those glow-in-the-dark ones where you shine the light on and it glows for maybe an hour or something. And, you could hold it up and kind of orient yourself in the sky. And that's how I really got started in astronomy, was really the binoculars. And that's why I still have a love of binoculars to this day. My first real scope, believe it or not, was an antique Edmund 4-inch f11 Newtonian. We had a neighbor that was a retired Lutheran minister that had moved into our neighborhood, and about 2 months after he moved in, his brother passed away, and I guess he got all his brother's goodies, and he didn't have enough room for everything, and he knew I liked astronomy, so he called us over and gave us the telescopes, and we fixed it up and cleaned it up, and used that into college years. It was actually a very good primary year. I changed the secondary and a bunch of other things, but it actually got me going fairly well. When I say brass clock drive, I'm not kidding. It was like tooth gear and had a little synchronous motor. It's hilarious. Compared to what we have now, it's hilarious what I was using back then. So over the years, I've used quite a few different scopes and binoculars. In my current lineup, I have several April refractors from 76 to 105 mm, and I've got a f11 165 Mac. That's my biggest scope currently. My binoculars include an 8x44, nice little portable set. I'm sorry, I keep holding my back. My apologies. And then all the way up to 25 by 100 IFs that I just bought this spring. And I really love those. They're a lot of fun. The moon and the sun look really good. They're framed really nicely on the image scale like those big binoculars. A lot of fun to use. And a few stabilized binoculars as well. Those are great for taking out on star events, nice and portable. I just wanted to, just so that I don't just visually observe, I have a couple of pictures that I took. And this was in Edmonton during the lunar eclipse, the lunar eclipse for those of you that remember in 2010. It was about 4 days before Christmas. It was one of the best events I think that you could get. And, I caught this one in totality. I got some really, really good shots. This was taken with my 40D and my 90mm at 14. So it turned out pretty good. This one here is a Teleview 76 shot, and this one, believe it or not, I put it on an alt-ass tripod, and I would just take a rapid succession of stills, and because the filters I was using actually had enough brightness, I was able to go fast enough on the shutter to pretty much get it fairly still. And this is a helium filter. This is actually there, it's 588, and it's plus or minus 4 nanometers. So I'm getting some of the sodium as well as helium, and this is on the back side of the Bader solar wedge after that reduction neutral density filter in lieu of a polarizer. And then I shoot it to the camera from there. So it came out not too bad. You can see some pretty good detail there. And then a standard white light shot, and for those of you, this was taken with my 80mm A-Pro. And again, this would be the standard setup with my M-series camera, and you can see quite a bit of detail on this, and I'm kind of proud of it. The scene was almost perfect that day. You got sunspots on there, obviously. Plages, for those of you that don't understand a lot of solar observing, plages on the photosphere, plage means beach, and it's basically bright areas that are on the verge of you starting to get magnetic differences. I won't get too technical for the moment, but they show up as bright areas, kind of blank areas outside of the granulation. And then, of course, the granulation, the little salt and pepper, that's basically convection cells on the sun that we're seeing the light coming off of. It's kind of cool. And faculae are usually the onset of flares, but I think there was one up on the top. I just kind of stuck it there. And then finally, Mercury transit a couple of years ago. I used my helium filter on tracking, and I happened to use a little bit more aggressive filtering, so it was actually a brighter image. That's why there's so much granulation and stuff showing on there with the helium one, and I did it in monochrome here. So that in a nutshell is a little bit about me. I think the biggest thing that keeps me going in the hobby, there's two things. I really enjoy helping people that are new to the hobby kind of learn, because it can be very overwhelming, especially when you have so much equipment to go through nowadays compared to even when I was a kid. There's so many choices that can be almost daunting. So, if I can help somebody, I'm sort of happy to do so. The other thing, too, is I've got a big inner child, and I'll admit it, and I always try to keep everything alive. The moonshots in 1969 kind of sparked my interest. When I was 4 years old, I stayed up with my folks up in watching Neil Armstrong walk on the moon, and that's it. I was hooked, right? So that's what kind of got me in the hobby. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, carry on with David.
Oh, there we go. God, that was stuck on there.
Yeah,
What are you trying to say? How do you point with the symbol? So that's just.
Everybody hear me? All right, I'm OCD, so I always have notes. I can't talk without notes, so. Yes, my name is Damon Nightshade. Yeah, it's true. It's actually attributed to a very good party I attended when I was 19 years old that I have absolutely no recollection of. I have vague memories of staggering, zigzagging to the Bureau of Vital Statistics at 8 in the morning, and an even vaguer recollection of some of my so-called friends convincing me that changing my name was a very good idea. But I digress. So how did I get into astronomy? I guess I started when I was about 9 years old. Science was my favorite class in elementary school. I loved all things sciencey: stars, planets, dinosaurs, rocks, sharks, volcanoes, you name it. So astronomy was kind of lumped into that. The year was, I guess, about 1977. Does anybody remember what came out in 1977? Star Wars, yeah. So when you're 9 years old and you start equating spaceships and strange worlds with Jedi Knights and lightsabers, how could astronomy not be the coolest thing ever? So that's kind of how I got into it. When I was 11 years old, I joined the Model Rocketry Club in school, which admittedly was less about payload and boost and more about blowing things up hundreds of feet in the air. But explosions are still science, right? Around this time, my parents bought me a Tasco refractor, one of the crappiest telescopes I have ever come across, and I think I've owned 3 of them throughout my life. They've all broken in the same spot over the years. I think this is a picture of what my first one looked like. It wasn't my original one, but that's what it looked like. And they all broke in the same little spots. Right there where the mount attaches to the tripod, every single one of them always snapped in the same spot, usually within weeks. So, I remember the first time I used this thing. I pointed at the Orion Nebula, and you can just imagine my disappointment of all those years looking at astronomy magazines and stuff, of finally seeing the Orion Nebula and thinking, why is it so small, and why is it in black and white? I was absolutely crushed. But, I mean, in the pre-internet era, this was my only link to the universe outside of our atmosphere. And, I mean, so I use this thing all the time. And I still, whenever I could save up my allowance, I bought all the astronomy mags just so I could see the pictures of what the nebula and the galaxies should look like if I had the proper equipment. And, what was I saying? And especially the photos of all those large aperture scopes in the back that were being advertised by Meade and Celestron that I dreamed of one day owning. At 13, I joined the Manitoba Astronomy Club. For those that don't remember the Manitoba Astronomy Club, it's basically where all the kids went to when you had an astronomy addiction because the RASC people wanted nothing to do with us little terrors. I remember going on a field trip to Glenlee when I was 13 and being told that don't bother the people from RASC or they'll never let us come here again. Unfortunately, my access to good equipment and a few years later my access to a motor vehicle started to reduce the amount of time I spent on the hobby. I'd still buy the latest Carl Sagan coffee table book, and I'd buy a couple magazines a year to try to keep tabs of what was changing in the science, but I just didn't devote as much time as I had used to. When I turned 18, I was an adult. I promptly moved out, and one of my first purchases was another Tasco telescope. Within the first month, it broke in the exact same freaking spot as the first one did. But I never gave it up. I mean, a few years later, I had more competition with the hobby than I had before. I discovered the opposite gender. In reality, I didn't discover them. They'd been there all along. They just hadn't known that I was there prior to that date. And suddenly in my mid-20s, some of them knew who I was, and some of them actually cared who I was, which was even more impressive. These I'll refer to as my cool years. I was suddenly cool, I hung out with cool people, I did cool things, and I did everything I could to hide the fact that I was an amateur astronomy nerd because that would have jeopardized everything in the whole charade. About 10 years later, I met my future wife and her daughter. They knew I was actually a closet astronomy nerd, and best of all, they actually supported it. I moved in with them, bought another telescope, another Tasco, and the same thing freaking happened. It broke again. So a decade passed. About a year and a half ago, I was about to turn 49, and I decided that for my midlife crisis, I wanted to buy myself a present for my 50th. As my wife informed me that a shiny new red Porsche and a 21-year-old girlfriend were totally out of the question, she was actually thinking of me because either one of those would have probably killed me. So I decided that I was going to buy a large aperture scope like the ones I had always seen in the back of the magazines. And my wife surprisingly said yes. I was even going to be responsible about it. I was going to go on Kijiji, find some old low-end Newtonian I was going to pick up for a song, use it for a year so that I was going to actually follow through with this and continue to use the thing before I bought my dream scope, which at the time was a 10-inch Meade LX200. That's the one that I had fixated on, and that's the one my wife gave me permission I could buy it in a year. So I programmed my Kijiji app to look for telescopes, and I checked my notifications every day for a couple weeks until I found a low-end Newtonian one that I picked up for a couple $100. And I used it, I think, twice in 2 weeks when I got a ping that another notification for a telescope search had popped up, and it was a 12-inch Meade LX200, and there went all of my responsibility at that point. My cool years had long passed, and I switched to a new phase in my life, the groveling phase. Honey, I know I'm not 50 yet, and I know I'm not good for 50 for another year, but look at all the accessories, and look how cheap it is, and it's 2 inches bigger than the one I wanted. Please, can I have this? And I love her. She said yes. If I could talk to the guy another $1,000 down off his original price. I was like, they're not going to take $1,000 less. Well, part of my day job is I'm actually a trained crisis negotiator, which means I'm a very good talker when I actually want to be. And my wife had no belief that I was going to be able to negotiate this, which is probably why she agreed to it. So when I pulled up at home with my brand new scope and a bottle of wine in each hand to try to placate her, yeah, I finally owned my new horribly unusable, pain in the ass to set up and strip down regularly, but I had the scope that I had always dreamed of, right? I have the large aperture scope. Apparently I had this undiagnosed case of something called aperture fever all my life, and I had no idea what it was, but I joined the... yeah, these meetings. I joined the RASC about a year, just over a year ago, I think, and I'm starting to get into my real area of interest, astrophotography, and I've discovered that I'm absolutely terrible at it. Which of course makes me want to do it even more than I already have. My wife purchased me for my actual 50th 3 months ago a digital SLR, so now I'm actually getting into the photography a bit more. So the saga kind of continues from there. As far as what do I like looking at from my scope, honestly, it's still M31 in the Andromeda Galaxy, because when I had my old Tascos, it was always a smudge that I could not make out, and it drove me nuts. So it was always kind of a symbol of what I wanted to see if I ever got one of those large aperture scopes. Now my goal is to actually take it out to a dark sky area and use it for imaging that. I tried it at the Star Party last year, which was a big soggy mess. So hopefully this year will turn out a little bit better. I've tried it from my backyard, but unfortunately the city bureaucrats have decided to install these new LED street lamps all over my street in the last 6 months, so I can't see a damn thing from my yard anymore. What inspires me to stay in the hobby? Honestly, it's the fact that I get the astronomy updates probably every couple of days on my email feeds. There's so many new discoveries coming in so fast right now, it constantly makes it interesting and refreshing. And my hatred of being bad at something, namely astrophotography, keeps me pointing my scope and my camera at the night sky every time I absolutely can. Because the 9-year-old in me is still convinced that the Andromeda Galaxy and the Orion Nebula should still be in color. So, that's it. Excellent. Thanks. So, that's quite special. Some of the first photos I've attempted, and then my new baby with the benefit for scale. Oh yeah, when I catch aperture fever, I go away.
Thank you. Okay, next up is Yasha. One thing I want to point out, I think the longer you've been doing this, the more these meetings feel like support groups. So if you're catching that vibe, it's real.
You guys hear me okay? Yep. Okay. Okay, so I'm Yasha. Some of you may know me as Jacob, but I'm going by Yasha. I've been a member for, again, just over a year. Similarly to Damon, actually, I relate to a story a lot, which is somewhat unmoving. But yeah, I was asked to answer these questions. I'm sorry about the right slide for the record. Didn't really put that into account. So I got into astronomy, as with a lot of people here, I think, with an inherent childhood interest in space. I was the person who was obsessed with it in school. Let's face it, I still am. And I really enjoyed looking at in books and magazines. I was subscribed to various space magazines when I was younger, and I still am. And but for a while, I didn't really consider astronomy as anything I could do because I'd always thought of it as being this expensive, hard to access hobby that only a privileged few with lots of money and knowledge can do. But my interest was rekindled around 3 or 4 years ago when one of our neighbors, one of our family friends, was moving, and he had an old Bushnell 76mm reflector, which was just as bad as it sounds. He had it lying around, and he said, "Hey, you guys want this?" And we said, "Sure." And I thought I was going to be a professional, observatory level astronomer right out of the box, and much to my disappointment, I was not. But it gave me my first views of the Moon and Jupiter, which, now that I look back on it, was quite surprising that I got anything from Jupiter, considering the quality of that telescope. But things surprise you. But that rekindled my interest in astronomy. And since then, I was looking for a new telescope, and about a year ago, I managed to purchase it. And just over a year ago, I did manage to join the club and come up to my first meeting. So, my favorite things to look at for a telescope. This is going to sound really, really cliche, but in no particular order, it is Saturn, Jupiter, and the Moon. Now, this may seem somewhat uninteresting, but it's kind of like classic literature, right? These things, they never get old. They're always available. Everyone knows what they are, but for good reason. They're always stunning to look at. I often find myself, even with so many objects in the sky, I often just find myself looking at the moon for hours on end in my scope. They're very bright, which is useful for me because I have a still 5-inch scope in the city, deep sky objects aren't particularly accessible. So Saturn, the Moon, and Jupiter are always, one of them's always in the sky. They're always visible and always nice to look at. In terms of what inspires me to keep going in the hobby, the views, duh. I mean, nothing beats looking through a telescope and seeing deep sky objects. Fuzzy very long, it's not all around. To most people that are meeting, you think that if you actually know what you're looking at, it has holds some significance. One of my favorite things to do is to introduce other people to the hobby. So a few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to go out to the Manitoba Museum with Scott Young, who's also a member. I don't think he's in attendance tonight, though. And come out with a few other members with our telescopes and kind of catch Fringe Fest crowds who were streaming out from the various venues. And on our second night, it was very good scene, relatively. And we had Jupiter, Mars, Saturn, and the Moon all visible. And some people are disappointed and uninspired when they see these things. But we had my telescope playing at the Moon, and some people see it and they go, "Oh, well, that's pretty interesting. Honeycomb, look at this. Oh, that's pretty cool." And then they continue on their way. But some people realize the scale and the magnitude of what it is they're seeing, especially the people who have never looked through a telescope before. And they go, "Whoa." And it's incredible to them because they've never seen these objects in person before. And it's those kind of moments that you really enjoy the most when you're doing these kinds of things. The community is also something that I enjoy quite a lot. Admittedly, if I were to be observing alone, it's not as fun as if you're observing with a group of other people who have the same interests as you and who enjoy these things as much as you do. Like at school, and the astronomy, no one else really relates to that. But if you surround yourself with people, and this goes for any hobby, if you surround yourself with people who have the same interests as you and who think the same way as you do, it really makes the whole thing a lot more enjoyable. At the start party last year, it was miserable most of the time. We got rained out so hard. But the first time, it was, most of our optics dewed up very early, but we still had a large group of people out with binoculars who were, even just with my relatively small aperture binoculars, I still enjoyed myself a lot more than I would have if it had just been me with my telescope. It's the interaction with other people who have the same interests as you that make the whole thing a lot more enjoyable. So yeah, that's me.
Thanks, Ezra. That was excellent. Okay. Last up is Kyla.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for letting me share the very first time that I'm here. I just figured it would be a lot faster for me to share to everybody at one time than individually introducing myself. So I'll start with a little bit about my childhood like everyone else. We have very similar experiences. When I was 10, I fell in love with the solar system, with the universe, but you kind of feel like, I'm not smart enough to be an astronomer. So it stayed there, the love of it stayed there, until I was 14. And then I got into Star Trek. And, you know, Damon, I have to say right away that I have that same telescope right now, and it is broken at the same freaking spot that yours is. So it's all of them. But yeah, I started with Star Trek, and I fell in love with the detail that Gene Roddenberry had put into everything. So it made it so believable. And so that when you think about, you know, human space travel, it became something that you kind of are like, that could actually happen. And so that started, or I guess it brought everything forward for me. And then I grew up in Ward, Manitoba, and when I was 22, I moved to the States, and I became the wife of an Army soldier. And we moved all over the United States and Europe. But during the deployments, I spent my time watching shows that were hosted by Neil deGrasse Tyson, and they were featuring Miko Kaku and all these more popular scientists that we see on TV. But I had a lot of time in the 12-month deployment, and even with kids, to kind of reacquaint myself with that original love for astronomy. And I don't know, are you guys familiar with a lot of these people?
Yeah.
Awesome. And so just recently, actually Professor Brian Cox is one that I've really, really enjoyed his program. My favorite thing to look at through a telescope is Jupiter. And the reason for that is after I lived in Germany, we were sent to El Paso, Texas for 3 years. And much like someone's experience in Arizona, the stars in the sky at in that particular spot are amazing. And if you didn't love it before, you would love it after being there. In fact, Gene Roddenberry is from El Paso, was from El Paso. And they have a planetarium there in his honor. And so one night I was attending a function with my kids, and they had just happened to have these telescopes set out. And you could come by and take a look. They had them set on certain planets. And when I saw Jupiter, it was the first time I'd seen a planet in real life. Like Yasha was saying, it's that first time that you actually see it in person. It's like meeting your favorite actor. And I was, after watching it on TV for 10 years, and then you see it in real life, it was just like, oh my God, it's Jupiter! You know, you just get so excited. And so from then on, I just continued to keep exploring. And as I explored, as I questioned, my curiosity grew. And it's very much like the expansion of the universe. The more I knew and the more I wanted to learn, it just sped up. And so eventually, I started getting into physics, so quantum physics and those kinds of things. I have to say that I'm horrible at math, which is another reason why astronomy seems to always be out of reach for me. And that's why I'm here, because I know that the hobby itself, I can still look at the stars and I don't need to be a mathematician. So this is Io. It's just one of my favorite moons that I have not seen in person yet, and I'm hoping to soon. Another thing that kept me interested or got me interested in astronomy was when I'm studying history, just watching the human progression of astronomy through the ages and how it was seen, by Kepler as something that was musical, and I've been a musician the last 20 years of my life, so it spoke to me on that level very, very deeply. And so these are just pictures of Galileo and all the other really good guys, Copernicus and everybody, and then just the ancient astronomical calendars and things that are very, very interesting. So like I said, I just continue to be interested in space-time, and I think a lot, and you probably all are very similar. And so instead of thinking about things that would make me worry or those kinds of things, I started thinking about things that would make me feel smarter after. And that was the one thing about Star Trek that was nice. You could sit down for an hour and you didn't feel like you wasted an hour of your time. Like you sat in front of the TV and when you're done, you're like, yeah, that felt good. So it's when I'm thinking about things like this, like space-time, general relativity, and quantum physics, it's not something I'm necessarily good at, but it's satisfying to be able to think about those kinds of things. And what keeps me interested is dark matter, dark energy. This is just an artist rendition, of course, of what it is, but it's the forefront. It's at the forefront of astronomy right now, and it's so exciting that you can wake up every morning and there's something new. There's something new to learn. And so you never feel like, well, that's it. I guess I got to the bottom of the barrel. So it's exciting to keep going. Right now, exoplanets are a big deal to me, and just being able to see us maybe one day get to Proxima B would be amazing. And then before, our educator had mentioned Sagittarius A star, and I think just studying black holes in general is an amazing thing that keeps me interested. And like I said, quantum physics. For me, trying to find the relationship between quantum physics and general relativity is something that it seems an impossible thing to find, but it's something that I keep thinking, like, there's got to be a connection, there's got to be something there. And so looking at things like the orange theory and how the universe is infinite in the way that it's infinite. And so a lot of these things I've come to just through philosophy and just combining philosophy with astronomy. And that's kind of, this is a picture of kind of how I feel like my mind is going the more I learn about it. So that's it. Thank you so much for letting me speak.
Thanks, Kelly. Nice. All right. So, I gotta say, that was awesome. Thanks for that. I'm really impressed by that. There were a lot of really cool threads that ran through that. I was particularly impressed at the classical literature reference and the comment about the drive always seeming to sleep back to that object that you really want. You're thinking you're going to go look for these deep, faint buzz balls. You kind of look at it and you kind of say, and then you just pan back to Jupiter, right? And it's funny, that realization that that's actually what you're doing. Anyway, so there are a lot of just amazing little threads there. So thank you to everyone that contributed. Just one more round of applause for everyone that came on the Okay. And with that said, that is the end of the meeting. Next month we will be back. Is there a question?
Yes, I just want to know how old you have to be to join the club.
Oh, that is a really good question. I think the youngest member that we've ever had was a couple months old.
Oh.
So
I can join?
You can totally join.
Yes.
You're in. Yeah. I'll let your parents take care of the financial side of that. Yeah, actually, one comment too. We're totally fine with kids. Like, it's fine. I mean, why? I don't know. It's crazy that the RASC was that bad back then. But at least, I don't know. In my opinion, I'd rather have a kid looking through a telescope than me, right? Like, that's generally how I feel. Yeah. So next month, it's going to be a little bit of a break just because of the way that the bomber games lined up. But next month we'll be meeting again on September 14th. September 15th, there's a planned start party with the Nature Conservancy going on. Dennis asked me to mention it. There weren't, I think it's a reattempt of what he tried, but was the weather didn't work out. So that is the weekend after the Spruce Woods start party. There will be more details about that later, but just if you want to mark a thing in your calendar, September 15th is going to be the Nature Conservancy start party. It won't be a big deal or anything like that, but there will be some information sent out. Other than that, for those that wish to join in, we will be going to Boston Pizza down Pembina for a few bevies and maybe a little bit of food. Stan, you got something?
I just want to mention one thing, and I think it's mentioned enough. We do have a newsletter that goes out, and everybody gets a copy of it. Mike Caracas has been working with it, and basically, you know, there's a lot of members who do pictures, and not everybody sees it. So he's compiling all this stuff, all this information, all this into the newsletter. So when Winnicentrics comes out, I really, compel everybody to go out and look at it now. It's in a totally electronic version, and it's quite colorful. And some of the astrophotography that's been put into it lately has been just exceptional. So
there is a stupid level of talent in this club that blows my mind.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a good point to bring up. Yeah, Winnicentrics, and if for some reason that if you're a member and you're not getting emails from me, or my name's Brendan, or from Jay who sends out the Winnicentrics, do let me know. And we don't have to talk right now. You can contact me through the website. Just go to the contact form. I see every email that comes through there. I'm not always the most prompt about responding, but I promise you I will. So anyway, but yes, so like I said, if you want to join us down at Boston Pizza on Pembina, by all means, please do. Other than that, that's a meeting. Thanks, everyone.
Oh, jeez.